There was one Sith weapon so catastrophic, the Jedi didn't destroy it. They buried it where no one was ever supposed to find it. Not the Republic, not the Senate, not even most of the Jedi Council. The fortress was dying. Black stone corridors collapsing inward as if the war itself was chewing through reality. An ancient Jedi strike team moved in single file, robes torn, sabers dimmed, chanting containment mantras that tasted like ash in the air. At the center of the ruin, a pulsing dark side engine throbbed, every beat twisting the force around it, every flare peeling sparks of unreality off the walls. This was not a Death Star. No superlaser, no reactor core, no convenient exhaust port. It wasn't a star forge, churning out an endless army of ships. This construct didn't fire at planets. It fired at the Force itself. It drank life out of the ground. It crawled into minds. It reached into the invisible web that bound every living thing in the galaxy and started rewriting the connections, thread by thread. Where it awakened, forests withered in minutes. Populations fell silent without a single blaster shot. Jedi walking through its shadow felt their senses buckle, as if the Force had turned its face away and left them standing in a dead, echoing universe. It wasn't a perfect system. The early tests had torn entire regions of space into raw, unstable Vergences, scars that even the Sith engineers were afraid to approach. So the strike team came, centuries before the Clone Wars, on orders so classified that their mission record would be sealed under a dozen code names and then erased. Their original plan was simple in the way only Jedi optimism can be. Breach the core, destroy the engine, end the threat. That was about to change very quickly. Because the closer they came, the clearer the cost became. Every attempt to destabilize the construct sent shockwaves lancing into hyperspace. Navigation beacons flickered. Known routes screamed in the Force. The Masters realized that a full detonation here wouldn't just kill a world. It could shatter hyperspace lanes, flip Vergences inside out, and fracture the very medium the Jedi used to touch the Force across the galaxy. So they made another choice, the unthinkable choice. This is the story of the one Sith weapon the Jedi were too afraid to destroy. Instead, they smothered it, wrapped it in binding fields and null seals, entombed it in a vault carved into a dead Vergence, and then did something even more radical. They erased it from history. Names struck from archives, star charts quietly edited, mission logs buried behind restricted classifications that even most masters would never see. But absence has a gravity of its own. The secret wars to find and contain weapons like this began to reshape Jedi doctrine. New rules about forbidden knowledge. New layers of secrecy between the Council and the rest of the Order. Echoes of this decision would surface in Clone Wars Black Ops, in the Empire's obsession with Inquisitors and Vergences, in the quiet way certain topics simply never came up in the Temple. At the heart of the fortress, the last Jedi Guardian stood before a colossal stone gate, carved with sigils so old even the Sith had stopped using them. Behind that door, the engine's pulse had been reduced to a distant, muffled heartbeat. The Guardian pressed his palm to the seal, whispered a final mantra, and spoke to the empty air. The Force itself must forget this place. The gate slammed shut. The fortress groaned. Starlight vanished. But the Force never truly forgets. The Guardian failed. The gate held. The memory didn't. This is the story of a weapon the Jedi tried to make the Force itself forget, and yet whose echo keeps bleeding through the margins of galactic history. To understand it, the timeline has to stretch far beyond one war, one council, or one Sith Lord, with a flair for capes and contingency plans. The scope here is massive. It begins in the high age of the Old Republic, when the Senate still believed the Jedi could solve any crisis with a meditation circle and a diplomatic shuttle. It runs through the rise and fall of ancient Sith empires, through forgotten containment wars fought in shadows, and all the way to tiny ripples in the Clone Wars and the Age of the Empire. Across thousands of years, across a galaxy of battlefields and temples, the focus is not a fleet, not an army, but one construct the Order tried to erase. The central claim is simple and terrifying. This buried engine represents the most dangerous idea the Sith ever had, not just ruling the Republic, not just breaking the Jedi, but editing the Force itself, rewriting the rules that bind life, death, and connection. The Jedi's answer to that idea became the most successful cover-up they ever attempted. It wasn't a perfect system, but for a very long time, it worked. So what Obi-Wan found on Geonosis was a droid foundry and a war. What earlier Jedi found were blueprints for something worse. In this video, the path is going to be reconstructed. The dark side science that powered the engine, the Sith savants and cults that built and rebuilt it, and the secret campaigns the Council launched under code names and sealed records to track every fragment down. Those campaigns did not end with victory parades. They ended in rituals. Jedi strike teams vanishing into dead sectors to entomb components in Vergences. Guardians chanting formulas to fold a weapon's presence back into the currents of the Force. Temples deliberately collapsed, archives partially burned, and, when necessary, memories quietly edited so that even masters could not betray what they no longer knew. Compared to this, the Death Star is almost honest. The Starkiller base, the Malevolence, every Kyber-based superlaser in the Separatist arsenal, they all announce themselves with beams and shockwaves. They target planets, fleets, cities. This earlier engine bypassed ships and shields entirely. It reached for the metaphysical layer, draining life, severing Jedi from the Force, threatening to turn an entire galaxy into a controlled experiment in obedience. That was about to change very quickly once the Clone Wars began to stir old secrets. Classified warnings in the archives, obscure legends of wounds in the Force, odd shifts in Jedi doctrine about prophecy and attachment, all of it starts to align when the Council's buried crisis is restored to the timeline. The planet was X. The year was Y. A throwaway line in an animated episode suddenly becomes a confession. By the end, the pattern behind those hints will be visible, and the choice the Jedi made to hide their greatest victory will look a lot more like the first move in someone else's plan. So before buried temples and erased archives, there was something else, a galaxy that thought it had already won. The great Sith empires were gone. The Mandalorian crusades were over. The Republic was old, confident, and very sure the worst was behind it. Hyperspace routes had finally settled into reliable arteries. The Hydean Way, the Corellian Run, the Polemian trade route, these weren't just lines on a star chart, they were veins pumping credits, culture, and information from the core to the rim. Major trade worlds flourished, Coruscant glittered. Corellia built ships for profit, not war. Even on the frontier, new colonies opened more banks than bunkers. In this era, the Jedi were exactly what the holodramas later pretended they always were, wandering peacekeepers. Thousands of Jedi Knights and Masters, spread thin across millions of systems, riding those stabilized lanes to mediate border disputes, stop pirate raids, and negotiate mining rights between rival corporations. The Council sat in a high tower on Coruscant, but its reach was more spiritual than military. No grand army, no clone legions, no standing fleets under Jedi command. The Republic Senate governed by debate rather than force. Bills, committees, endless arguments on the Senate floor, that was the main weapon of the central government. There were wars, but they were small, local, and usually very boring. A planetary militia here, a mercenary company there, nothing that threatened the galaxy as a whole. No planet-killing weapons on the horizon, no superlasers hanging over every negotiation. It wasn't a perfect system. As trade routes solidified, so did the bureaucracy around them. Permits, tariffs, regional governors with more influence than oversight. In the core, corruption meant lobbyists and backroom deals. In the outer rim, corruption meant whole sectors effectively run by crime syndicates, while their official representatives napped through Senate sessions. The Jedi saw some of this, but over centuries, their response shifted. Less active investigation, more reliance on tradition, prophecy, and the belief that the light side would naturally prevail over chaos. This is the story of an order convinced that if they guarded the great temples and honored the old warnings, the Force itself would filter out anything too dangerous. Early Sith activity barely registered as an exception. Scattered cults on dead moons, a hidden alchemist on a forgotten world, twisting creatures with dark rituals, rumors of blood-red holocrons changing hands in shadow markets. The Council treated these as clean-up operations, not existential threats. Dispatch a small team, confiscate the artifacts, seal the mission record. Problem solved. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino in the Clone Wars was a secret army. What earlier Jedi were about to find made that look almost reasonable. Because the Order believed it understood the dark side. Duels, empires, tyrants, Sith meant warlords and lightning, not equations and engines. They had almost no framework for a weapon that could twist the Force on a structural level, something that didn't just kill bodies, but rewrote the field those bodies lived in. That was about to change very quickly, the moment the first quiet anomalies started to appear on the edge of known space. The first signs didn't look like a war. There were no fleets, no Sith banners, no armies landing in formation, just a quiet wrongness, spreading through the edges of the galaxy where no one was supposed to matter enough to weaponize. Jedi on distant assignments started filing the same kind of report. Worlds where life felt thinned out as if someone had taken the Force and turned the volume down. Forests went quiet. Herds of grazers stood motionless for hours, then, without warning, tore into each other in blind animal panic. Meditations that should have brought clarity came back as static. Not the familiar turbulence of the dark side, but a flat grey interference, as if the Force itself was being jammed. At first, the Council treated it as background noise. The Republic was vast, Vergences shifted, strange currents moved through the Force all the time. It wasn't a perfect system. But then came the moon. The planet was unnamed. The year was irrelevant. On a lush outer rim satellite known only to its farmers and a few trading captains, crops withered overnight in perfect concentric rings. Not blight, not weather. Circles, kilometre-wide bands of dead grain and grey soil, precise enough to make an archivist nervous. Local shamans spoke of a silent storm that had rolled over the fields, yet no one remembered seeing it, hearing it, or waking up while it passed. Every Jedi who landed there complained of the same thing. Headaches behind the eyes, a pressure in the ears, visions that broke apart mid-image, fragmenting into geometric shards before any meaning could form. When they reached for the living Force, they found only echo, as if the moon had been moved half a step away from reality. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino had been an army. What these knights found was absence, and absence is much harder to fight. The Council's first interpretation was conservative. Localized dark side nexuses had appeared before. Sith alchemy could poison soil, warp beasts, leave scars that lingered for centuries. The official orders were calm: treat these as contaminated sites, deploy small teams, perform cleansing rites, re-anchor the area to the light. This is the story of a council that still believed its standard rituals could handle anything the Sith had ever built. Those rituals failed. Purification ceremonies that should have brightened the land barely dented the disturbance. Meditation circles ended with masters stepping away in quiet unease. A few Jedi emerged with a lingering numbness in their connection to the Force, as if some percentage of their sensitivity had been shaved off and filed away. One knight, a veteran of a dozen battlefields, quietly resigned from active service after losing the ability to sense life at all. For the Order, that was more frightening than any duel. Back in the archives, the mystery escalated. As reports accumulated, analysts began to map the incidents: the withered moon, the thinned forests, the silent temples. On a star chart, they formed a faint ancient pattern, tracing an almost forgotten route associated with a long-dead Sith architect. a name the Jedi had buried in restricted stacks and sworn never to speak. That was about to change very quickly, because the pattern was still being drawn. The name the Jedi refused to speak belonged to a being who refused to accept the galaxy as it was. An ancient Sith Lord, half engineer, half prophet, who looked at empires and thought they were thinking too small. Conquering planets, toppling the Republic, killing Jedi by the thousands? To this mind, that was maintenance work. This is the story of a Sith who wanted to edit the source code. Most Sith dreamed of thrones. This one dreamed of constants. In their writings, the Force is never a mystic will or a cosmic song. It is an equation, a field that can be biased. They argued that light and dark are not moral destinies, but statistical outcomes. Tilt the math, and the average being in the galaxy will reach anger faster than empathy, fear faster than trust. It wasn't a perfect system, sentience and messy, but to this architect, probability was enough. If every argument on every world broke toward rage just a little more often, if every frightened clone or conscripted droid commander found hate easier than hesitation, the dark side would win every war before it started. So what Obi-Wan found in the archives centuries later was not a manifesto. It was a lab notebook. Early entries describe crude Sith alchemy, blades and talismans tuned through kyber resonance to make wielders more volatile, more brutal. Then the scale jumps. Villages drained in ritual circles. Slave armies marched into geometric kill zones, their deaths mapped as data points in a grand experiment about how much suffering it takes to bend a region of the Force. Whole moons were turned into testbeds. Forests withered in perfect spirals where life drain rituals had been iterated and refined. From orbit, the scars formed patterns, each one a failed or partially successful attempt to push the local balance toward darkness and make it stay there after the chanting stopped. Over centuries, the architect moved from personal weapons to planetary prototypes, great buried engines, fed on sacrifices, humming at frequencies that made Kyber scream. The Republic never heard about these trials. The Jedi Council did, and responded with quiet, deniable wars, strike teams sent under sealed orders, temples cut from the records, witnesses mind-wiped when necessary. Later ages would build the Starforge to mass-produce fleets, and the mass shadow generator to crush armies under weaponized gravity. Those were terrible. They killed bodies, shattered worlds, rewrote battlefields. But this design aimed lower and deeper, not at ships, not at stars, at the underlying currents every Jedi and Sith draws from. The architect's holocron survives in fragments, locked in the most restricted vaults. In one projection, the Sith Lord appears amid a lattice of equations and star maps and says only a single design brief, a machine that makes the galaxy itself prefer the dark. Then the image zooms out and the first complete blueprints of the buried weapon flicker into view, large enough to bracket whole systems. And the terrifying part, the part the Jedi never put in any report, is that the holocron does not show a prototype. It shows a finished installation, with coordinates missing, cut out by a trembling hand. The holocron's image dives inward, past the redacted coordinates, into the cross-section of the thing the Jedi refused to name. Not a battle station, not a fleet, a wound given shape. It's a hollowed-out planetoid, cored like a fruit pit and replaced with machinery. Concentric rings of alloy and stone form a colossal engine, each ring bristling with pylons of polished obsidian. Between them, spires of black crystal kyber rise like frozen lightning, piercing from crust to core, all angled toward a central chamber where there is, very deliberately, nothing, no reactor, no throne room, just a spherical void labeled in dead Sith glyphs as the null field. This is the story of a weapon that didn't fire at ships. It fired at meaning. Every surface of that interior is inscribed with channeling veins, carving pathways for energy that isn't supposed to be engineered at this scale. The outer rings anchor the planetoid in real space. The inner rings twist its interior into a controlled Vergence cage, forcing the Force itself to behave like current in a circuit. So what actually powered it? Not a single kyber core. That was about to change very quickly from the usual Sith superweapon formula. The architects chained Vergences instead. Sacred groves, battlefields soaked in memory, entire worlds where life and emotion ran hot for millennia. Each site was bound to the planetoid through hyperspace tethers, turned into a living battery the size of a continent. When one world exhaled in prayer or war, the machine inhaled. It wasn't a perfect system. Vergences resist being used, so the Sith tortured them. Ritual engines on the surface of those worlds bled fear, rage and despair straight into the links, keeping the connections raw and open. The more a population suffered, the cleaner the signal. The galaxy became one vast, unwilling power grid, and the switch sat in a hollow moon. When activated, the weapon didn't explode anything. No beam, no flash. Just a wavefront rolling out through hyperspace, inverting local force polarity as it passed. Light-side impressions were stripped from places and people, like paint sandblasted off a mural. Jedi caught inside felt their senses shear away. Battle meditation collapsed. Precognition went silent. Survivors didn't just lose connection, they lost color. Grief felt distant. Joy felt counterfeit. What remained sat very close to fear, and fear is where the Sith do their best recruiting. Destroying it should have been the obvious answer. But every ring, every kyber spine was tuned to those chained Vergences. Overload the core, and the backlash wouldn't stay local. Corrupted energy would rip back along the hyperspace links, shattering into fragments and seeding countless mini-nexuses of instability across the galaxy. Imagine entire sectors where the Force twitched and screamed at random for 10,000 years. So the original Sith architect did something else first, a test. A remote minor world on no major hyperlane, but still populated enough to matter. The planet was X, the year was Y. No fleets, no warning, just activation. From orbit, nothing happened. On the surface, Jedi sensitives dropped to their knees. Temples went quiet. Children who had dreamed of starlight woke up and felt nothing. The wave passed in minutes. The wound it left in the Force would echo for millennia. And somewhere in the archives of the future Republic, a nameless dead world would be quietly filed away as an ecological anomaly, while the Council tried to decide if the galaxy could survive knowing what had done it. The planet was X, the year was Y. A Midram world the Senate barely mentioned, but the Jedi knew it as a place that sang in the Force. Oceans laced with glowing plankton, hilltop temples where children painted the dawn. Cities that never really slept, they just dimmed the lights and let the stars take a turn. This is the story of how that song went silent in a single afternoon. It began with light. Not a bombardment, not a separatist fleet. A silent aurora that rolled across the sky without thunder or heat. Colors bent in ways local physicists could not name. Curtains of pale green and violet sliding over each other as if the whole ionosphere had become a slow, deliberate wave. People pointed. Children laughed. Pilgrims on the temple steps thought it was a blessing. That was about to change very quickly. The temperature dropped. Not in the air, in the marrow. A wave of cold moved through every living thing, from the canopy forests to the deepest reef. No explosions, no shockwaves. Starport stayed intact. Towers did not even rattle. For a few impossible minutes, an entire world held its breath, while something invisible passed straight through its nervous system. Then, nothing. The aurora faded. Traffic resumed. Markets reopened. Birds kept flying. The first collapse happened in a commuter tram. Then a school. Then a monastery. Within an hour, emergency channels were flooded. People remained standing where they'd been, eyes open, breathing, gone. A vast percentage of the population slid into coma or a blank, emotionless stupor, hands still wrapped around tools, styluses, half-filled cups. The ones who stayed on their feet were not spared. They woke up with their empathy dulled, humor flattened, violent impulses quietly turned up. arguments in the street escalated to assaults. Domestic disputes jumped straight to murder. It wasn't rage, it was absence. There was nothing in them pulling the punch. By the time the council dispatched a small Jedi team, weeks had passed. The Senate filed it under regional catastrophe. No army, no declared war, just a mystery. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino had been a clone army. What these Jedi found was the opposite of an army. A planet that could barely remember why anyone had ever cooperated. They expected plague or civil conflict. Instead, they stepped off their transport into a society going through the motions. Families sat at dinner tables, passing dishes with perfect efficiency and no conversation. Street performers mimed routines to audiences that watched, then walked away without a single credit exchanged. Schools operated on time, no laughter, no art, no joy. In the Force, the world felt wrong. Jedi described it later as static, a dull, uniform hum where a vibrant chorus once lived. Mind tricks slid off blank gazes. Healing trances stabilized bodies, but nothing reached the missing spark behind the eyes. One master, a veteran of too many battlefields, broke down in the middle of a city square. There were millions of beings within reach, but not a single distinct presence. Just a grey pressure, as if the whole biosphere had been averaged out. Republic scientists brought instruments. Jedi brought esoteric sensors the Senate never heard about. Deep beneath the crust, both sets of readings agreed on one thing, a faint, receding energy signature vectoring away into interstellar space, an afterimage, already cooling, pointing toward nothing on any chart. It wasn't a perfect system, but the Council knew patterns. Ancient records spoke of Sith engines that did not just kill, but rewrote the Force around them. Here was proof. Something had reached into a living world and twisted its connection at the root. And as that signature faded into the dark, the Jedi realized the most terrifying part: the weapon had only been testing its range. So now the Jedi knew the range had been tested. What they did not know was who pulled the trigger or when it would fire again. On Coruscant, the response was immediate and quiet. The Council did not call a public session. They called a conclave. Senior masters abandoned scheduled hearings, diverted transports mid-flight, and sealed the high chambers of the temple. Traffic in the upper halls was cut off. Padawans were redirected. Curious knights were told there was a routine security drill. Inside, it was anything but routine. Holograms of the deadened world rotated in the center of the chamber. Reports from healers, seers, and Republic survey teams played in sequence. A planet where the Force sounded like static. No armies, no fleets, just a wound. Some masters argued this was the opening move of a reborn Sith Empire, a prelude to war on a scale the Republic had not seen in 1,000 years. Others insisted it was worse, not an empire, but an experiment, a proof of concept for a weapon that could erase the Jedi without firing a single visible shot. This is the story of how the Order chose to fight that threat in the shadows. The Council understood the Senate, announced that an unseen Sith weapon could turn entire worlds into facescent husks, and the result would not be calm deliberation. It would be panic, emergency powers, militarization, and on the fringes of the galaxy, every half-trained cultist would start trying to replicate the effect. That was about to change very quickly if the truth got out. So the Council did something it rarely admitted to doing. It went off-book. All information about the event was sealed under temple classification, accessible only to a handful of masters and their direct agents. Officially, the survey mission had encountered an unstable Vergence and withdrawn. Unofficially, the Council began assembling strike teams that did not exist in Republic records. Each unit operated under a code name, answerable only to the Conclave, their movements scrubbed from starport logs and mission rosters. These were not standard peacekeeping detachments. Healers with an almost surgical sense of life energy. Consulars gifted in sensing distant ripples in the Force. Masters trained in battle meditation to steady entire crews. They were paired with Republic scouts used to flying beyond mapped lanes, and with a few sympathetic scientists who understood energy signatures better than politics. Centuries before the Clone Wars, the Republic had its Black Ops. The difference here was that the Jedi ran them, and the secrecy was even tighter. Their mission parameters were brutally simple. Track the residual signature that had scarred the dead world and follow it across neighboring systems. Map any recurring patterns in force disturbances, even if they were only momentary flickers. Identify any construct, artifact, or architect that could have generated that field. And if they found it, they were to capture or destroy it without leaving a trail in public records, or even in most Jedi archives. It wasn't a perfect system. By choosing secrecy over transparency, the Jedi prevented a galaxy-wide panic and denied the Sith a wave of eager imitators. But they also ensured that only a tiny fraction of the Order understood the scale of what they were facing. For the rest, the war that was beginning did not exist, and in the dark between systems, something was already watching the teams hunting for it. Out in the black, the hunt didn't look heroic. It looked tedious. It looked impossible. The weapon didn't leave craters or shattered moons. It left hairline fractures in reality that only the most obsessive Jedi even noticed. Hyperlanes that felt sluggish. Pilots reporting that jumps through certain corridors took the right amount of time, but arrived with their crews emotionally drained, speaking in flat voices, unable to remember what they dreamed in hyperspace. Worlds whose populations weren't dead, weren't enslaved, weren't in open war with separatists or pirates, just quietly apathetic, as if someone had turned the volume of sentient feeling down by half. In the Force, it was worse. Masters described it as touching a scar that didn't hurt, because the memory of the wound had been erased. No sharp darkness, no raging Sith presence, just a blank, a deliberate absence pressed into the currents of the galaxy. This is the story of Jedi trained to sense fear and anger hunting for something that made those emotions simply stop existing. So what Obi-Wan found in the Clone Wars years later was foreshadowed here by nameless knights tracing ghosts through charts and star maps. They logged minor anomalies, a freighter whose crew forgot an entire week, a monastery world where every initiate abandoned their vows on the same day, not in rebellion, but in total indifference. It wasn't a perfect system. Most reports were dismissed as local plagues, economic downturns, or the usual failures of Republic bureaucracy. That was about to change very quickly on a barren moon at the edge of a red dwarf. The planet was ash. The year was irrelevant. The team that landed expected another dead Sith shrine. What they found was a derelict outpost, half collapsed, its walls carved with spirals of equations. Not tactics, not troop movements, pure theory. Symbols mapping how the Force flowed through minds, how fear propagated through crowds, how to bottleneck and redirect that current. At the center, they recovered half a Sith holocron, its gatekeeper flickering in and out, voice shredded by time. One phrase came through clearly: the engine that will make fear the galaxy's default state. Not a superlaser, an engine. Something designed to sit in the background of history and quietly reset what emotions were normal. Back on Coruscant, the archivists finally had enough data to do what they did best. They overlaid centuries of minor disturbances, navigation complaints, and those strange reports of planetary apathy. On a flat map, it looked random. On a three-dimensional projection of the outer rim, it snapped into focus. A vast spiral path, threading between major trade routes, always avoiding heavy Republic patrols, slowly tightening toward a cluster of ancient Sith worlds. Inside the Council, the pattern triggered a different kind of disturbance. Some masters argued this was the point. The weapon, or its creators, were baiting the Order along a pre-written route toward a final ambush on ground chosen by the Sith. Others countered that every delay meant more systems quietly emptied, more populations turned emotionally mute, without ever raising an alarm in the Senate. The debate ended when a strike team dropped out of hyperspace over a remote, nameless system and felt the Force shudder. Not explode, shudder, as if a distant organ had just been tested for the first time in centuries. Below, the world looked intact, but its sky was wrong, colors washed out, sound almost muffled. Animals didn't startle, children didn't cry. The only evidence was a faint distortion high above the atmosphere, a heat haze in vacuum. The Jedi raced toward it in orbit just in time to see a silhouette vast, spined, more cathedral than starship slip into hyperspace on a trajectory that matched the spiral. One glimpse, one shadow. From that moment, the Order stopped hunting anomalies and started hunting that shape. From that moment, the Order stopped hunting anomalies and started hunting that shape. But the only thing they caught first wasn't a ship. It was a voice. Buried under a collapsed Sith shrine on a dead moon, a strike team found a holocron that did not want to be opened. The casing was scorched durasteel, wrapped in fossilized bone, ringed with microglyphs that reacted to heartbeats. Touch it without preparation, and it spat arcs of caged lightning, trying to stop a mind before it could even form a question. This was not a library. It was a landmine. The gatekeeper inside, a projected Sith teacher, had been marinating in dark side currents for centuries. Its face flickered between different hosts, voices overlapping, logic fractured. It laughed at the Jedi, then tried to possess them, then tried to burn out their senses with raw terror. It took 3 masters in meditation, locking their presences together, just to pin the thing down long enough to copy fragments of the original research journals. Those fragments changed the entire hunt, because they finally answered a question the Council had been asking for 1,000 years. What does a Sith like this actually fear? Not defeat, not the Jedi. The Holocron's author wrote obsessively about something else. Vision after vision of a distant age where the Force balanced itself, bleeding off extremes until both Jedi and Sith became irrelevant footnotes. A galaxy where there was no need for an order, no need for an empire, no need for any priesthood to interpret the will of the Force. For a Sith whose entire identity was built on being necessary, that was the nightmare. So the weapon's purpose snapped into focus. This was the story of a machine built to bias the entire cosmic field toward permanent agitation. A device that would keep the galaxy's emotional temperature a few degrees above peace forever. The logs were meticulous and horrifying. Controlled experiments across frontier worlds. Populations exposed to graded pulses of force disruption. Empathy dialed down by a fraction, paranoia dialed up. The author recorded how quickly local councils collapsed, how fast strong men rose, how often neighbors turned in neighbors. It wasn't a perfect system. Some communities resisted longer than others. The Sith simply annotated those as variables for later refinement. If this sounded familiar to later historians, it should. The same cold fascination with engineered imbalance would echo in Palpatine's manipulation of the Clone Wars, a republic and separatists tuned against each other, fear and distrust amplified until war felt inevitable. Different century, different army, same idea. The galaxy as a control panel, the Force as a circuit to be permanently overloaded. And then the final entries took a darker turn. The creator anticipated failure, anticipated Jedi intervention. So what Obi-Wan found centuries later, chasing that cathedral-shaped silhouette, was only phase 2 of a much older plan. If the core construct was ever truly threatened, the weapon could enter seed mode, shattering its own schematics into encrypted holofragments and scattering corrupted Vergence links across the stars. Not destroyed, just waiting. Hidden in temples, in battlefields, in quiet planets no one on the Senate floor had ever heard of. The Jedi thought they were chasing one ship. That was about to change very quickly. The trail ended at a world the charts only marked as Car Delba Null. No trade routes, no Senate records, just a dead coordinate wrapped in red. From orbit, the planet looked like it was bleeding into space. The atmosphere tore itself into spirals of crimson storm, lightning veining through clouds that never broke. Around it, an artificial asteroid belt of shattered moons glowed faintly, each fragment still bleeding molten seams where entire satellites had been fed into an engine. This is the story of the first time the Republic saw that engine awake. The task force sent to intercept it was small by galactic standards. A pair of Venator-class star destroyers, a carrier loaded with Lark gunships and V-wings, a screen of frigates and corvettes. Not a superweapon hunting armada, just the kind of mixed group the Senate could spare without triggering panic on the holofeeds. On the bridge, a handful of Jedi stood in front of clone officers who had been briefed on almost nothing. There was a Sith construct ahead. It could wound the Force. That was the mission profile. It wasn't a perfect system. The Jedi meditated in the calm before reversion, reaching for the currents of the Force that usually threaded every battle. Instead, they felt a hole, a pressure. As the fleet dropped out of hyperspace, the ringed engine came into view, hanging in low orbit over the bleeding world, its segmented halo locked around a central core like a Durasteel eclipse. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino had been an army secretly wired for control. What these Jedi found above Car Del Banol was worse, a machine that treated the Force itself as ammunition. The first wave of V-wings fanned out. Pilots reported good locks, clean vectors. Then the engine flared. Not a full beam, just a low, pulsing activation, a red corona rippling along the ring. In an instant, the battle broke without a single shot fired. Clone aces lost their edge mid-roll, hands hesitating on controls they had drilled 1,000 times. Gunners on the Venators froze with targets painted, fingers slack on triggers. In the meditation chamber, Jedi screamed as their precognition shattered into static. The Force did not go silent, it went wrong. One night, pinned in a spinning starfighter, found the only way out. She closed her eyes, stopped reaching forward in time, let go of the Force, and let training take over. Muscle memory, not mysticism. The spin leveled, the shot landed. For a few seconds, everything made sense again. The order spread in clipped, incredulous comms. Helmets down, visors black, fly blind. Across the task force, clones taped over displays, Jedi shut down battle meditation, and the Republic attacked its first Sith superweapon half-blind on purpose. It worked, in a brutal, limited way. Turbolaser volleys, aimed by Dead Reckoning and fire control computers, chewed through peripheral pylons and external focusing spines. V-wings on manual runs clipped sensor arrays and tore open coolant veins. Pieces of the ring went dark, tumbling into the red storms below. But the core remained. And the engine adapted. As the outer structures failed, the central aperture began to charge, light condensing into a needle aimed straight at the command ships. The Jedi could feel that, even through the interference. Not as a vision, as a verdict. Retreat orders went out over channels already fraying with panic. Hyperspace solutions were plotted on the edge of guesswork. One Venator took the brunt of the partial discharge, its hull peeling open as if time itself had skipped a frame, entire decks erased without fire. The survivors jumped. The bleeding world and its wounded ring snapped back into starlines and vanished. The engine survived. The Republic limped away. And on Coruscant, the Council now had to explain how a single machine had just rewritten what it meant to be a Jedi in war, while the Sith construct quietly prepared for its next shot. On Coruscant, the debrief ran into a wall almost immediately. Standard Republic doctrine said the answer was simple. You find the enemy superweapon, you throw an army at it, and you keep hitting it until there's nothing left. That was about to change very quickly. The Jedi who had been nearest to the blast, the ones who had actually felt the engine fire, told a different story. They described its core as a knot in the Force, not a crystal, not a reactor. A collision of Vergences, light and dark twisted together so tightly that even touching it through meditation felt like grabbing live wire. Every projection the Council's tacticians ran ended the same way. A direct strike on the core didn't just risk destroying the machine, it risked tearing that knot open. This is the story of why the Jedi, who had spent 1,000 years cutting down Sith, suddenly became very shy about swinging a lightsaber. Masters reached for metaphors and kept coming back to the same one. The weapon was a black hole in the Force. Throwing more energy at it didn't guarantee a clean kill. It threatened to feed the singularity. A bombardment that would have slagged a separatist foundry world might instead punch a wider wound through reality, severing whole sectors from the Force or flipping them permanently toward the dark. The Jedi had seen echoes of that on Malachor, on worlds where ancient Sith engines had burned so hot that even centuries later, every meditation felt slightly off. So the Council turned to the only group more anxious than the generals, the Seers. They tried to model outcomes the way a Republic analyst would model trade routes, meditation circles, shared trances, forced visions. What they saw refused to settle. Branching timelines shattered into cascades. In one, a dead galaxy cold and silent, where the Force had gone thin and brittle. In another, scattered pockets of hyper-corrupted space, red storms in the current, where fallen Jedi rose again and again because the field itself demanded Sith. Pattern interrupt. One vision didn't end in fire. It ended in silence. No stars, no war, just a blank where cause and effect stopped making sense. That one frightened the Council most. Out of that chaos, a minority proposal emerged. If destroying the engine meant gambling with the fabric of the Force, then the only rational move was containment. Smother it. Encapsulate the core in neutralizing structures, echoing the old temples built over dangerous Vergences. Bury it in ritual and stone, in wards that neither light nor dark could easily penetrate, and hide it somewhere its influence would be minimized by distance, geology, and the natural currents of the galaxy. It wasn't a perfect system. It meant accepting that the weapon would continue to exist, humming away in the dark. Many Jedi found that idea obscene. The Order had been founded on the promise that the Sith and their creations would be confronted, not filed away. But the Council looked at the numbers, listened to the visions, and reached a grim conclusion. The least bad option was to imprison the engine forever, assuming they could survive long enough to reach it again and find a world willing to become its grave. So if destruction was off the table, the only option left was madness. Build a prison not for a person, but for an idea. This is the story of the Jedi trying to lock the Force itself inside a box and throw that box into the dark. The architectural plan came first, because the Senate needed schematics before it signed away half a sector's budget. Jedi artisans and Republic engineers sat in the same war rooms, sketching a containment shell that was less ship and more mobile fortress temple. A hollow core, big enough to cradle the engine at stasis. Concentric rings of support struts. External thrusters and tractor harnesses so the whole thing could be dragged through hyperspace to some forgotten grave world. It was a temple built backwards, not around a sacred light, but around a void they were terrified to ignite. That was about to change very quickly once the mystics got involved. The Council knew durasteel and ray shields meant nothing to a weapon that fed on resonance, so they layered the shell in consecrated stone quarried from worlds with neutral Vergences. Between those slabs, they embedded kyber crystals tuned deliberately to flat frequencies, cancelling peaks in both light and dark. Along the inner corridors, they carved chant circuits, engraved mantras that guided meditation flows from Jedi volunteers stationed in tiny anchor cells, their continuous contemplation braided into the walls as a living dampener. The goal wasn't to overpower the engine. The goal was to make the Force around it so dull, so featureless, that there was nothing for the weapon to grab. Of course, none of that could be explained on the Senate floor without starting a galactic panic. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino with the clones, the Council now recreated on a different scale. A polite fiction hiding a terrifying reality. Officially, the project was logged as a deep space archive and monastery, a remote sanctuary where dangerous artifacts and volatile Vergences could be studied far from civilian lanes. Senators heard library, heritage site, cultural preservation. The actual line item was a mobile sarcophagus for a Sith engine that had once erased whole enclaves from the Force overnight. It wasn't a perfect system. Inside the Order, the arguments were louder. Some knights called the shell hubris, a single point of catastrophic failure the Sith would inevitably target. Others countered that scattering fragments of the engine across the galaxy would only multiply the risk. One prison, heavily hidden, or 1,000 little disasters waiting to happen. The debate never really ended, the council just ran out of time. Because the last problem was the most brutal. The shell had to be taken to the engine, assembled in hostile space, and activated while the weapon's own field shredded navigation and communications. Jedi planners quietly flagged the mission as non-returning, and on the fringes of the war, Sith loyalists were already converging on the same coordinates, determined to wake their god machine before the Republic could bury it alive. So now you had a Republic task force flying into a planet the Jedi had tried to erase from memory, non-returning, bleeding in the Force. This is the story of the day they tried to put a lid on a star going supernova. The cruisers dropped out of hyperspace hard, alarms already screaming as the dark engine's gravity well clawed at their hulls. The planet was ashrid, veined with luminous cracks where the weapon's field had burned straight through the crust. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Each cruiser disgorged modular temple segments into low orbit, kilometer-long durasteel monoliths inscribed with counterchants and null fields, while clone pilots in ARC 170s and Jedi starfighters ran interference against Sith cultist gunships clawing up from the atmosphere. Segment by segment, the shell began to take shape, not a battle station, a coffin. Massive repulsors shoved the pieces into alignment around the invisible heart of the engine's disturbance, locking together with seismic booms that echoed through the fleet. It wasn't a perfect system. Joints buckled, power grids overloaded, and every adjustment had to be made while the entire war zone was trying to tear itself apart. That was about to change very quickly. As the outer ring neared completion, the dark engine pulsed. No turbolaser, no shockwave, just a pressure in the Force that hit every living mind at once. Across the Armada, Jedi lost coordination mid-maneuver, hearing voices that weren't there. Clones in the hangars dropped to their knees under waves of despair, convinced the war was already lost, that the Council had abandoned them. On the surface, half-starved Sith devotees straightened, eyes blazing yellow, suddenly fighting with the speed and precision of trained assassins. So what Obi-Wan found in the Clone Wars with inhibitor chips, this weapon did with raw metaphysics. It reached in and rewrote the emotional battlefield. To finish the job, a small team went straight into the throat of it. A strike shuttle knifed through the interference and latched onto an exposed conduit tower leading into the engine's core. Inside, gravity shifted direction every few meters, hurling them against bulkheads as they dragged stabilizer pylons and anchor beacons deeper into the construct. The corridors whispered, promises of victory, accusations from dead Padawans. One knight froze with his saber at his own throat, convinced he was the saboteur. His commander slapped the blade aside and ordered clones to carry him the rest of the way. At the center, they planted the anchors into a churning lattice of black crystal and rusted Sith machinery, locking the engine's heart to the growing shell above. In orbit, the final segment slid into place with a shudder that rattled every deck. On the shell's equator, a circle of masters ignited their blades, then extinguished them, dropping into a shared trance. They poured light-side energy through the engraved channels, turning the entire structure into a single, massive binding glyph. For a moment, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The dark engine bucked, clawed against its new walls, then froze its current state flash-printed into the shell so it could never fully wake again. The victory held. But the price was immediate. Several masters came out of the trance half-blind in the Force, their senses permanently scarred by what they had touched. The world below, its population already cracking under months of psychic pressure, was evacuated or relocated under strict watch, then declared off limits by the Senate and the Council both. No nav charts, no archive entries. Officially, the system did not exist. Unofficially, of course, it was now the most dangerous secret in Jedi history, and the Sith were very good at finding secrets that were supposed to stay buried. So containment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a second problem. Where do you hide a weapon that can whisper through hyperspace and bleed through the Force itself? The answer was distance and motion. Once the shell was stable enough to move without tearing open reality, the Jedi turned it into its own prison ship. Massive thruster rings were grafted around the containment hole, not sleek Republic engineering, but brutal functional scaffolds designed by masters who were suddenly thinking like siege engineers in a very quiet war. Tugs locked on. Astromechs plotted a route that bent around every major hyperlane and known vergence. Then the convoy jumped, not to safety but to absence. Their destination was a place the archives barely acknowledged even before it vanished. A lightless system, orbiting a dead star that had burned out before the Republic was born. No habitable worlds, no gas giants, just a scatter of cold rock and a gravity well that had given up. The planet was X, the year was Y. It wasn't a perfect system, it was better, it was nothing. On one of those planetoids, the Jedi went to work. Mining crawlers chewed a hollow deep into the crust, carving a cavern large enough to swallow the entire containment shell with room to spare. Access shafts spiraled down in tight, disorienting arcs, intentionally confusing the architectural equivalent of a mind trick. The shell was lowered on repulsor cradles until it disappeared into the dark, then entombed under meters of rock, duracrete, and labyrinthine tunnels that looped back on themselves or ended in sealed blast doors that opened onto more stone. Then came the part no droid could help with. A council of masters gathered in the hollowed corridors above the shell and began a rite that took days. Meditation in shifts, chanting in dead languages the Sith had once used to bind this engine, now repurposed to smother it. They didn't destroy the presence, they blurred it. Residual dark side signals were bent into closed circuits, harmless feedback loops that chased themselves in circles. Subtle misdirection was woven into the local currents of the Force, a kind of spiritual hazard sign that nudged wandering sensitives to look away long before they thought to investigate. On the surface, the cover story took shape. The system was tagged in the most restricted archives under an innocuous codename, filed between unremarkable logistics entries. Physical star charts were edited to flag the coordinates as a navigation hazard, a collapsed hyperlane node with nothing of value. So what Obi-Wan found, decades later in a different archive, would register as a boring anomaly at best. This is the story of a secret the Council never wanted to tell twice. Before they left, one last Guardian recorded a message in a stonewall control chamber, addressing an audience that, in theory, should never exist. If anyone is watching this, it means the Jedi Order has failed. The wars you know are nothing. Reactivating this engine would make every future conflict in the galaxy feel merciful. That recording in the stone chamber was only half the containment protocol. Locking the weapon away was one thing. Making the galaxy forget it had ever existed was the other. This is the story of a weapon the Jedi didn't just bury in rock and durasteel. They buried it in their own history. The purge began in the archives, and it did not look dramatic. No flames, no smashed holocrons raining shards across the marble floors. Instead, it was quills, access codes, and librarians working late after the temple lights dimmed. Mission logs that once named the world, the casualties, and the exact dark side construct encountered were quietly refiled under generic headings. Major dark side incident. Unclassified Sith activity. Jedi losses, significant. The planet was X, the year was Y, the details were gone. Scrolls that mentioned the weapon's true function vanished from public stacks. Holocrons containing technical diagrams were moved to deep storage or, in a few cases, ceremonially destroyed in sealed vaults so the energy backlash could be controlled. So, what Obi-Wan found on Geonosis centuries later, when he complained about the archives being incomplete, was not a new problem. It was a tradition. Above all of this sat a rigid tier system. It wasn't a perfect system. At the top, a handful of High Council members retained full awareness, the weapon's design, its location, the names of the Sith who had forged it. Alongside them, a narrow order of specialists emerged over time, wardens of the vault, whose entire job was to remember the things everyone else was being encouraged to forget. Beneath them, even veteran masters only received a sanitized version of the story. A dangerous artifact had been contained. The Force had been preserved. Details were irrelevant to their current war against the Sith. For the Jedi who had actually stood in the weapon's shadow, that official line was harder to swallow. Some could not stop seeing the faces of clones and civilians it had hollowed out, or feeling the way the Force itself had screamed. Those knights and masters were offered mind healing. In extreme cases, they were compelled to accept it. Healers framed it as mercy, gently blurring the mission's geography, the schematics, the activation sequence, while leaving the emotional lesson intact. The terror remained, but the intel that could rebuild the device did not. This choice containment through ignorance echoed forward. In the prequel era, the Council classified prophecies about the Chosen One, downplayed scattered Sith sightings, and buried contingency plans that assumed the Senate could fall. Each of those decisions came from the same scar, the belief that too much knowledge could be more dangerous than too little. That was about to change very quickly in the centuries ahead, when a Sith would finally exploit that blind spot. Because if an enemy knows the Jedi once chose not to remember a particular kind of threat, how long before someone rebuilds it, confident their opponents won't even recognize what they're seeing? So the question hangs over the entire Republic era. By erasing this weapon from their own minds, did the Jedi make the galaxy safer, or did they script the exact ignorance their enemies would need? So the question hangs over the entire Republic era. By erasing this weapon from their own minds, did the Jedi make the galaxy safer, or did they script the exact ignorance their enemies would need? The Council answered that question in the only language an institution really understands: new rules. This is the story of a buried machine that kept rewriting doctrine from underground. In the aftermath of Containment, the High Council quietly drew a red line through entire branches of Force research. Anything that smelled like what the Sith had done was out. Large-scale life drain, prohibited. Attempts to braid multiple Vergences into a single circuit, shut down. Grand theories about tuning the emotional climate of whole populations to stabilize the galaxy, those started to look less like philosophy and more like a blueprint for the very thing they had just buried. Publicly, these were framed as prudent safeguards against the dark side. Privately, Council minutes what little survived redaction hint that specific techniques were banned not because they failed, but because they worked a little too well. It wasn't a perfect system. Brilliant healers found their research halted because it brushed against mass transfer principles. World-protecting rituals were shelved because, on paper, they resembled the weapon's field equations in reverse. That was about to change very quickly for the next generation of Jedi. Training shifted. Where earlier eras had celebrated exhaustive understanding of the Force, Padawans now heard a different lesson. Some knowledge is inherently corrupting. Trust the Council. Trust the sealed doors in the archives. Trust that if a holocron is locked behind 3 authorizations and a warden of the vaults, there is a reason, and that reason does not need to be personally verified by a 13-year-old with questions. So what Obi-Wan found in the Clone Wars, those blank spots in the records, those classified references to ancient superweapons, wasn't an accident of sloppy librarianship. It was the end result of centuries teaching Jedi that obedience around forbidden knowledge was itself a virtue. Curiosity became something to be managed, not a compass to be followed. Even the seers changed. Before the burial, some Jedi had been willing to cast wide, scanning futures that spanned centuries and civilizations. Afterward, prophecy became narrower, more tactical. There was a quiet fear that if visions roamed too far across galactic scales, they might brush against the weapon's lingering echo or another construct built on the same principles and drag that pattern back into a vulnerable mind. A few documented breakdowns among visionaries were enough to convince the Council that the risk was real. As the Sith retreated into the shadows and the rule of two took hold, this anxiety about systemic dark side engineering had a strange side effect. The Order began to focus on individuals. Dark Lords, apprentices, duels, the idea that the true threat might again be a field, a network, a hidden machine reshaping the galaxy's emotional weather, that faded into legend, then into nothing. The Jedi hunted Sith, but stopped hunting Sith weapons. Hierarchy hardened, secrecy thickened. When confronted with dangerous phenomena, the reflex became suppression over open study, burial over debate. And somewhere beneath their feet the original weapon waited, quietly proving that for the Jedi, the most powerful construct in the galaxy was no longer the Force itself, but their fear of what it could be turned into. Because the next time the Republic started seeing entire star systems tip into coordinated fear and rage, almost no one in the Order would recognize the pattern, and the one person who did would be the last being they expected. That one person who recognized the pattern? The Order buried his report in the same place they buried the weapon's name. Deep under the Jedi Temple, below the meditation gardens, below even the hangars, there was a different kind of battlefield. Narrow aisles, cold air, no windows. This was the vault. Rows of sealed cases and durasteel shelves where wardens of the temple monitored everything the Council didn't want circulating through an already anxious Republic. They had a color code: green for benign, yellow for dangerous, red for things that changed the way a Jedi slept at night. Red-tagged artifacts, red-tagged scrolls, and in one dim aisle, half forgotten even by the librarians, a cluster of cracked holocrons and anonymous flimsoplast folios that all referenced the same thing without ever daring to name it. A nameless engine, a construct that drank the Force on distant worlds. Fragments talked about stars that went quiet without going dark, Jedi who felt entire sectors go emotionally flat, Sith who treated planetary auras as fuel. It wasn't a perfect system. The Wardens couldn't destroy everything, so they did the next best thing: they smothered it in bureaucracy and silence. But silence in a temple full of teenagers is a challenge. Padawans ran errands for archivists, carried data rods, overheard half-whispered arguments between masters in the vault antechambers. A single phrase would slip out: Force-eating star, silent storm. The great nod. They went back to their dormitories and turned those fragments into horror stories. So this is the story of how a classified containment protocol became a campfire tale. In training camps on distant fronts, clones and Padawans traded rumors about a star that could swallow lightsabers, or a storm that walked between systems, erasing Jedi from the Force. Technical schematics and redacted mission logs turned into images, a bleeding sky over an empty city, a temple where even the echoes sounded tired. Out in the wider galaxy, the distortion went even further. Fringe Force cults scavenged old Sith ruins on dead moons, reading half-melted inscriptions about a hunger in the sky that once crowned their ancestors with power. Darkside sects on forgotten separatist worlds preached that the Great Knoll would return to cleanse the weak, promising an age where the Force itself bent only to those willing to feed it. That was about to change very quickly once the Clone Wars pushed Jedi and Sith back into those same ruins. Episodes on Mortis, journeys to ancient Sith temples, visions of drained planets and red horizons all carried an eerie rhyme. Bleeding skies, worlds that felt hollow to the Council, force wielders who could shut the Force off in a single gesture. None of it was the original weapon, but the imagery was too close to be coincidence. So what Obi-Wan found in forgotten inscriptions on worlds the Senate barely remembered, Anakin saw again in visions of burning fields and silent, frozen clones. The planet was unknown, the year was undefined, the pattern was unmistakable. The Jedi tried to bury a weapon and its history under stone, codes, and erased mission numbers. Yet the Force kept retelling the same warning in symbols, in cult prophecies, in battlefield visions. The lesson refused to stay buried, and the next time that hunger in the sky idea surfaced, it would be wearing a very familiar face. That hunger in the sky idea did not die with one buried engine. It became a rumor in the dark. A half-remembered nightmare that later Sith tried to turn into a blueprint. This is the story of the people who went looking for it on purpose. Most Sith warlords wanted armies, fleets, thrones, but a different breed grew in the shadows of fallen empires. Sith archaeologists, dark side scholars who treated battlefields as libraries and extinction events as case studies. They weren't charging at the Jedi with blades drawn. They were combing through ruined worlds, cracked holocrons, and Forbidden Republic survey logs, hunting for anything that hinted at a machine that could tilt the Force itself. To them, the buried engine was not just another superweapon, it was a holy grail. The Death Star could destroy planets. This thing had once threatened to unmake the balance that let Jedi exist at all. If a Sith could rebuild even a fraction of that, the war against the Republic would stop being a cycle of empires rising and falling. It would become permanent. No more golden ages followed by purges, just one endless night. So what Obi-Wan found on Geonosis for Kamino and clones, these scholars tried to find in forgotten sectors for dark side physics. The planet was irrelevant, the year was irrelevant. What mattered was the pattern, dead systems with inexplicable emotional scars in the Force, ancient separatist-era survey routes that took strange detours, Jedi strike teams whose mission reports ended in sealed addenda and classified coordinates. They never found the primary vault. The Jedi had been too thorough. That was about to change very quickly in another way. What they did uncover were secondary facilities, test beds, calibration labs, places where the original Sith engineers had tuned Vergence chains and experimented with emotional field manipulation on a smaller scale. A shattered moon observatory with rings of crystal pylons. A derelict station whose corridors still whispered panic to anyone who walked them. Corrupted holocrons that mentioned ratio harmonics and population scale attunement but cut off before describing the core engine. It wasn't a perfect system. Every time a Sith cult dug too deep, something else moved. The wardens of the Council kept their own maps of dark excavations. Quiet listening posts in the Outer Rim. Discreet agents in the criminal underworld. When a dig site got too close to the old parameters, a natural quake collapsed the valley. A pirate raid conveniently hit the freighter before it could leave orbit. An ion storm shorted out every recorder on a survey ship. The secret war over knowledge continued long after most senators thought such things were fairy tales. Then, one cult almost broke the pattern. On a nameless backwater, they pieced together a fragmentary mini-engine from prototype components. Not a galaxy killer, a local Vergence knot. Enough to twist the emotions of a continent, to make fear and rage self-sustaining. When it flickered online, Jedi across the sector felt a wrong note in the Force. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple strike teams. No negotiation, no public debate in the Senate. The site was annihilated, the cult erased, the planet written off in the archives as a minor industrial accident. The galaxy never heard about how close that fragment came to stabilizing. But the Sith did, and the rumor that the engine could be rebuilt only grew stronger. The engine was gone. The site was glass. But the idea survived. In the shadows of the galaxy, Sith engineers and dark cults kept chasing the same dream. A machine that didn't just fire a beam, but rewrote the terms of reality. This is the story of how that buried failure turned into a blueprint no one admitted they were using. Centuries later, on the far side of known space, the Star Forge rose. An ancient factory wrapped around a star, spitting out warships and droid armies without rest. On the surface, it was an industrial miracle. Underneath, it was a cousin. The Forge drank stellar energy and fed on the dark side, using a living nexus in the Force to push production beyond anything the Republic had ever seen. It wasn't a perfect system. The more it built, the more it poisoned its own creators, proving the same lesson the original engine had written in blood: tap cosmic fields at that scale, and the Force starts charging interest. Other projects went smaller in size, but not in ambition. The mass shadow generator on Malachor didn't build fleets, it turned gravity itself into a weapon. One activation, one impossible spike in mass, an entire Mandalorian armada crushed in an instant, their ships torn apart as the planet's own gravity well went feral. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino was a clone army. What earlier Jedi found on worlds like Malachor was the aftermath of dark side science trying to bend fundamental forces until they snapped. The pattern was clear. First the engine, then the forge, then devices that twisted gravity, leached life, and amplified terror, each one rediscovering half-buried principles without understanding where they came from. By the time of Palpatine, the language had changed, but the goal had not. Under the Empire, Kyber-based superlasers were sold to the Senate as deterrents, battle stations, not dark altars. But those planet killers still relied on the same idea: focus an impossible amount of energy through a crystal matrix, guided by Force-sensitive intuition and Sith doctrine, until a world's crust, atmosphere, and biosphere became a single obedient flash. Around those projects, the Emperor sponsored quieter experiments, battle meditation programs to break enemy morale, Inquisitor training that weaponized fear, contingency plans like Operation, Cinder that targeted planetary ecosystems, and emotional resilience at the same time. War stopped being about armies meeting in space. It became a science of permanent trauma. Destroy the fleet, the food supply, and the will to resist, and the galaxy would police itself. That was about to change very quickly once the Clone Wars began, but the mindset was already in place. No one ever rebuilt the original engine. Not completely, but its ghost lived on in how the Sith thought, how the Republic reacted, and how every new regime measured victory in broken planets instead of captured ships. And in the age of clones and battle droids, that ghost was waiting. Because some of the war's most brutal campaigns would be fought on worlds already scarred by the engine's ancient test planets, where the Jedi marched in, set up command posts, and never realized they were walking across their own forgotten warning sign. The planet was X. The year was Y. And the Clone Wars were about to dig something up the Council had spent 1,000 years trying to keep buried. The planet was X. The year was Y. The war had a different name now, but the terrain was the same. The Clone Wars. Millions of soldiers born to die, thousands of Jedi sent to lead them. This is the story of a galaxy marching into a brand new conflict on battlefields already tuned by an ancient one. On the surface, the lines were clear. The Republic versus the Separatists, a clone army facing endless droid legions. In the Senate, emergency powers and security bills. On the front lines, Jedi robes over armor plates, lightsabers over troop formations. But under all of that, the same old frequency was humming: fear as a resource, war as a ritual, the Force itself as something you could bend with enough pain. At the center of it sat one man, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, playing both sides, just as the earlier Sith architect had once tried to tune the entire galaxy through a single weapon. Dooku led the Separatists. Sidious commanded the Republic. Two faces, one will, using a 3-year war the way that buried engine had used a single blast radius, redraw the map of what the Jedi could feel. So what Obi-Wan found on Geonosis was not just a droid foundry and a political conspiracy, it was the perfect stage. Jedi herded into an arena built on a world already buzzing with old dark side echoes, then rescued by an army bred in secret. The Council called it a victory. The Force registered it as something else entirely. From there, patterns kept repeating in ways most characters never named. Christophsis, Ryloth, Umbara, Malachor-adjacent sectors. Worlds where emotions ran too hot, where fauna reacted violently to troop movements, where ancient ruins showed up in the background of holobriefings and no one had time to ask why. The war map was supposed to be about hyperlanes and supply routes. In practice, it dragged the Jedi across a lattice of old disturbances the Council had once sworn to quarantine. The Jedi adapted, but in a very specific way. After the trauma of that first Containment war, the Order had trained itself to classify and compartmentalize. Dangerous artifacts went in restricted vaults. Missions were redacted, memories were tidied. It wasn't a perfect system. In peacetime, it kept the archives from becoming a how-to manual for Sith apprentices. In wartime, it meant the Jedi were excellent at treating each new anomaly as an isolated incident. A Sith mask here, a corrupted Kyber prototype there, a strange nexus that scrambled clone behavior on one campaign, and a shrine that muted Force visions on another. Missions to secure these sites felt familiar. Small strike teams, sealed reports, quiet recommendations to the Council. They were echoes of the old Containment era, but almost no one on those gunships had the context to see the melody repeating. Pattern interrupt. The real superweapon of this war was not a beam in the sky. It was the battlefield itself, because while the ancient engine had tried to overwrite the Force in one catastrophic pulse, Palpatine's design was slower and more precise. Clones grown with inhibitor chips the Jedi could not sense. A war tempo that normalized constant loss. Council chambers filled with trauma, guilt, and political pressure until meditation felt more like triage than clarity. That was about to change very quickly. Just as the ancient council had underestimated a device aimed at the Force, the Prequel-era council was underestimating a plan aimed directly at their own senses, a lattice of orders, chips, and orchestrated grief that would one day fire all at once and prove that the most dangerous Sith weapon in history did not need to glow in the sky to turn the Jedi blind. Order 66 was not just a command code, it was a smaller, smarter version of that ancient dark engine, rebuilt inside living soldiers and wired directly into the heart of the Jedi's trust. From Kamino onward, every clone in the Grand Army of the Republic carried an inhibitor chip in his brain. Invisible, unquestioned, a piece of surgical programming that sat dormant through years of campaigns, jokes in barracks, and rescues where clones literally carried wounded Jedi off the field. Then, at a single spoken phrase, those chips could override free will, suppress conscience, and flip millions of brothers into perfectly coordinated Jedi-killing automatons. One sentence. One signal. A galaxy of friendships turned into firing squads. On the surface, it looked brutally simple. A contingency order buried in military protocol, enforced by biotech, executed by soldiers trained from birth to obey. It wasn't a perfect system. Some clones hesitated, some fought it. A few, like Fives and Rex, came terrifyingly close to exposing the whole design. But the genius wasn't in flawless execution, it was in where the knife landed. Because in the Force, Order 66 wasn't just mass treason, it was a synchronized emotional detonation. For decades, Jedi had led these units, shared danger with them, built bonds that the Council quietly hoped would humanize war. All of that became a weapon. When the chips activated, those bonds snapped almost simultaneously across the Republic. Temple to outer rim, cruiser to jungle outpost, millions of threads of loyalty and affection were cut in the same instant. To a Jedi, that doesn't just hurt. It scrambles the senses. The Force is not an abstract energy field in their daily experience, It's a living mesh of relationships, intentions, and probabilities. This is the story of beings who read danger a heartbeat before it happens because they can feel fear rising, anger sharpening, trust settling into place. Order 66 injected panic, confusion, and personal betrayal into that mesh everywhere at once, turning the Jedi's own sensitivity into a liability. That was about to change very quickly from a war the Council believed they were slowly winning into a moment where their greatest advantage, calm, trust, and precognition collapsed right when blaster fire started. Just as the ancient Sith engine had twisted emotional fields around a battlefield, this new design didn't primarily aim to destroy matter. It aimed to corrupt the emotional weather of the galaxy so that every Jedi trying to reach for serenity found only shock, grief, and the muzzle flash of a clone's rifle. Whether or not Palpatine ever read the sealed accounts of that buried superweapon, he intuitively rebuilt its core effect on a distributed biological scale. The clone army became a living, decentralized dark side device, an engine made of uniforms and serial numbers instead of stone and kyber. The planet was Kamino. The year was the final one of the war. And the Sith had quietly installed their superweapon in every gunship, every command post, every mess hall. The tragedy is that the Jedi had once faced something like this and chosen to bury the very idea of field-level force manipulation. By erasing that category from their own archives, the Council left itself without the conceptual tools to recognize Order 66 as a soft superweapon. So when the Force went dark and the clones turned, the Order saw treason, bad luck, and blaster fire everything except the one thing it actually was, the return of the weapon they had sworn the galaxy would never face again. So when the Force went dark and the clones turned, the Jedi thought they were watching their own army betray them. In the ruins of the temple, the Sith saw something else. They saw a vault. Order 66 didn't just kill the Council, it opened the doors. Imperial intelligence, Masameda, Inquisitors in training, all moved through those shattered halls on Coruscant with one mandate from the new Emperor: take everything. Holocrons, star charts, restricted scrolls, even the sealed memory cores that only the High Council had clearance to access. The public story was securing dangerous Jedi propaganda. The real project was far more ambitious: strip mean 1,000 years of fear and contingency planning and hand it to one man. Buried in those seizures were fragments of a much older crisis. Damaged mission logs mentioning containment theaters, redacted war journals that spoke of a force-eating engine that didn't just kill Jedi, it erased them from the current of the galaxy. Construction manifests for a burial project so large it needed entire Clonera depots as cover. It wasn't a perfect system. The records were incomplete, coordinates stripped, names replaced with code names. But the pattern was still there. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino had been a secret army waiting for orders. What Palpatine found in the ashes of the temple was something stranger, proof that the order he'd just destroyed had once been terrified of a weapon that made even Sith Lords look small. This is the story of an emperor realizing he is not the first monster to try to rewrite the rules of the Force. That was about to change very quickly how he framed his own research. On Exegol, hidden from the Senate and even most of the Imperial hierarchy, Palpatine poured resources into cloning, essence transfer, and the strange mathematics of Force dyads. The Death Star, on paper, was a political weapon, terror by superlaser. But viewed through the lens of those archive scraps, it doubles as an experiment in emotional engineering. Kill a world, broadcast the horror, drown the galaxy in fear, and tilt the ambient force toward the dark. 3 projects. One goal: reshape the climate of the Force itself. And yet, with all that, he never sends a Star Destroyer to crack open the Jedi's forgotten tomb. The reason is simple and, for Palpatine, uncharacteristically cautious. The ancient engine is unstable. It drinks the Force without caring who is holding the cup. A Jedi, a Sith, a clone with a rifle, a senator with a speech, it makes no distinction. Palpatine prefers tools he can aim, superlasers with firing solutions, inquisitors with dossiers, propaganda with talking points. A blind, galaxy-scale drain that might decide the Emperor is just another candle to snuff, that stays buried. So the Empire rises and falls with the tomb still sealed, its stone never touched by stormtrooper boots. But the idea of it does not stay buried. Somewhere in those confiscated archives, in half-remembered cult sermons and corrupted holocrons, the rumor survives. Once, the Sith built a weapon that could eat the Force. And in the power vacuums after Endor, that whisper will become a roadmap for warlords who dream much bigger than superlasers. The only question is who finds that roadmap first and whether the tomb is still asleep when they arrive. The Empire falls. The Death Star is gone. The Senate is reborn in a new chamber with new flags and the same old exhaustion. The New Republic has a galaxy to triage, and its priorities are brutal and simple. Demilitarize, put war criminals on trial, get food and clean water to worlds the Death Star turned into debris fields and refugee camps. The Clone Wars and the Imperial War left entire sectors hollowed out, their economies and ecosystems stripped for armies that no longer exist. So the new government pours credits into shipyards and hospitals, not excavation teams hunting rumors the Jedi never put in any report. This is the story of a galaxy that thinks its superweapon problem begins and ends with a battle station. The council that once knew better is dust. The archives that once held the red-stamped warnings are slag on Coruscant. No one in Mon Mothma's cabinet wakes up thinking, maybe there's an ancient Sith engine buried under a dead world. They are trying to keep fuel flowing and former stormtroopers from joining the next warlord. It wasn't a perfect system. But from their perspective, it was rational. The known threats were already overwhelming. The unknown ones, by definition, did not exist. Out on his own, Luke has an even bigger blind spot. His Jedi Order is being rebuilt from fragments, Obi-Wan's ghostly advice, Yoda's parables, scattered holocrons, and a handful of half-burned texts that survived the temple's fall. The temple vault that once classified the Dark Engine as needs or no, for masters only, is gone. The librarians who bent the rules to keep that knowledge alive died in the purge. So what Obi-Wan found across a lifetime of Republic service, Luke only ever gets in hints and metaphors. That was about to change very quickly, but not in the way anyone expected, because the Force does not lose paperwork. Dagobah's cave shows Luke a vision where his own face stares back from Vader's shattered mask, a localized wound where the dark side pulled and fed on fear. Harkto has its own mirror, that sea cave, slick with darkness, whispering in Rey's mind, offering answers if she will just lean into the hunger. These are not the engine's doing, but they rhyme with it. Same melody. Different verse. Across the sequel era, Vergences keep bubbling up. Strange dyads bind two people across the galaxy into a single feedback loop. Visions of burning temples and fallen Jedi repeat on different worlds. Every time someone tries to industrialize the Force, to turn it into a weapon or a program, the cosmic field throws up the same warning, imbalance, engineered terror, the danger of control at scale. The institutions forget, the Force remembers, which raises a problem the New Republic never budgets for. If the archives are gone, the council dissolved, and Luke's curriculum missing the one footnote that mattered, what happens when the next generation of dark side seekers opens that buried tomb with all of the ambition and none of the context the Jedi once died to provide? So now that buried question becomes a sequelera problem. The archives are gone. The council is dust. And out in the ruins of the war, a new kind of scavenger is walking the galaxy with a crossguard lightsaber and a shrine to Darth Vader. Kylo Ren is exactly the kind of person the Jedi were afraid of. Not just angry, devotional, he builds an entire identity around a helmet, a bloodline, and the fantasy of finishing what his grandfather started. He hunts down Jedi relics, Sith wayfinders, anything that promises a shortcut past the slow work of training into the raw theatrical power he thinks the Sith represent. This is the story of a man who would absolutely chase a rumor about a hunger in the deep that once made the High Council panic. That was about to change very quickly the moment he put his hands on the wrong fragment, because that is all he would ever get, fragments. The Jedi who knew the full story are dead. The restricted stacks that mention the Dark Engine in careful, terrified euphemism burned with the temple. Palpatine, who might have recognized the signatures, had no interest in advertising a rival path to apotheosis. So what Obi-Wan found in neat, cross-referenced scrolls, Kylo would only ever see as scattered Sith runes on broken holocrons, half-corrupted nav data pointing toward extinct systems, and maybe a line in an old cult text about a machine that drinks the Force. It wasn't a perfect system. A few clues survive. A damaged First-Order probe droid records an impossible null reading in deep space. A Knight of Ren raids a forgotten shrine and comes back muttering about a buried engine that once made entire sectors go dark. On their own, each piece is noise. Together, they start to look like a map. But the galaxy is big and the tomb is cheating. The burial world sits in a Force-neutral pocket off every major hyperlane, wrapped in misaligned coordinates the Jedi seeded into surviving charts on purpose. Astrogation droids treat the region as a rounding error. Even a determined Sith fleet could jump that sector 1,000 times and never land on the right rock. Random discovery is essentially off the table without something stronger than math, a guiding vision, a Vergence pulling a Darksider in by the throat. That is where the narrative potential lives. Imagine a future story where Kylo, or a successor raised on his legend, starts dreaming of a dead star that bleeds no light in the Force. They follow that call, reach the burial world, and break into the vault, only to learn the Dark Engine does not answer to command codes. It answers to sacrifice. Whole populations, Jedi, Sith, it does not care. Even a fanatic might hesitate when the price of ultimate power is feeding an entire army into a machine. For now, the weapon sleeps. Buried, contained, technically inaccessible, but not gone. The planet was forgotten. The year was irrelevant. The Dark Engine is a Chekhov's gun in the galactic basement, waiting for the one story reckless enough to pull it back onto the stage. For the Jedi, burying the Dark Engine wasn't a triumph. It was a confession, a quiet admission that there were wounds in the Force so deep, even they were afraid to touch them. This is the story of a no-win choice. Destroying the engine risked a metaphysical chain reaction, a blast of unbound dark-side energy that could have rippled through hyperspace, cracked Vergences, and severed entire sectors from the Force. Leaving it intact meant preserving a blueprint for extinction. There was no clean option here, only different flavors of unacceptable. The case for burial starts with that risk. Ancient records from worlds the Council never named spoke of Sith constructs that, when shattered, didn't die. They detonated. Whole ecosystems went grey. Jedi on neighboring systems reported sudden silence, as if 1,000,000 presences had been put behind glass. The Dark Engine was worse. It didn't just channel the dark side, it rewrote the rules of how life and the Force talk to each other. So what Obi-Wan found on Geonosis, a secret battle station and a rushed clone army, was terrifying. But the masters who sealed the engine had stared at something even more obscene, the possibility that one mistake could scar the galaxy's spiritual physics forever. From that perspective, entombing it under a dead world, locking it behind rituals and wards and memory seals, starts to look less like cowardice and more like triage. The Jedi existed to protect life. In that moment, the path of least immediate harm was to put the gun in the basement and weld the door shut. But there is a case against that decision, and it only gets louder with history. By erasing the engine from the archives, by limiting knowledge to a handful of masters and then letting those masters die, the Order amputated its own institutional memory. Future generations never learned that the dark side could be weaponized against the fabric of the Force itself. They trained for blades and lightning. They were not ready for algorithms and orders. So when the Sith came back with Order 66, with inhibitor chips buried in clone brains instead of a crystal superweapon on a forgotten moon, the Jedi were blindsided. The Republic's army became the instrument of their extinction, and the Council had no category for an enemy that turned obedience into a distributed superweapon. It wasn't a perfect system, it was a perfect blind spot. That blindness wasn't an accident. The same mindset that buried the engine is the one that dismisses Anakin's nightmares as attachment, underestimates Palpatine as just a politician, and waves off the Outer Rim's suffering as an unfortunate side effect of war. Control over transparency. Secrecy over shared resilience. The Order kept choosing to hide the darkest truths instead of teaching its knights how to face them. So did the Jedi actually save the galaxy from the worst possible outcome, or did they just kick the problem down the timeline, training themselves to look away until the next Sith found a quieter, smarter way to pull the trigger, because the dark engine stayed buried? But its lesson didn't. That was about to change very quickly. The dark engine didn't just vanish under a temple floor. It burned itself into the Jedi nervous system. From that point on, the Order wasn't only afraid of Sith weapons, it was afraid of the ideas that made them possible. This is the story of how one buried machine quietly rewired Jedi culture. The Council had always maintained some taboos, but after an engine tried to drink the Force dry, those taboos hardened into doctrine. Certain dark side techniques were no longer advanced topics. They were never spoken of. Not battle meditation's shadow twin, not rituals that drained life to fuel power, not the equations that had once turned a Sith laboratory into a planetary noose. So what Obi-Wan found years later in the restricted stacks was only the tip of a much larger glacier. The Jedi archives became a maze of sealed wings and redacted holocrons. Access wasn't about curiosity or merit, it was about control. Younglings heard that some questions were inherently dangerous. Knights learned that asking about specific eras, specific campaigns, would get them a quiet meeting with a master and a gentle warning to focus on the present. It wasn't a perfect system, but for a council that had watched a Sith engine nearly unmake the Force, it felt necessary. Once the Order had seen knowledge almost destroy the thing they were sworn to protect, it became much easier to justify locking away anything that even rhymed with that danger. If a technique manipulated planetary ley lines, classified. If a holocron discussed siphoning energy from living armies, buried. If a theory treated the Force as a resource to be engineered instead of a mystery to be served, erased, then sealed again just in case. Centuries later, that reflex showed up in personal moments the galaxy actually did see. Yoda's caution with Luke on Dagobah wasn't just cranky minimalism. It was the voice of an institution that had learned to ration information. Don't tell him the full truth about his father. Don't walk him through the fine print of the dark side. Keep the training narrow, controlled, survivable. The same pattern haunted the Clone Wars. The Council never fully briefed Anakin on the prophecy, on the rule of two, or on how many times the Sith had tried to industrialize the Force. Ahsoka's independent investigations into corruption and conspiracies made Masters visibly uncomfortable, not because she was wrong, but because she was behaving like the kind of curious operative who once followed coordinates to a dark engine and came back with a story the Order never wanted to repeat. Here's the twist. By treating knowledge as a threat instead of a tool, the Jedi left entire metaphysical frontiers to the only people willing to explore them, the Sith. Dark side science, superweapon theory, techniques for severing or rewriting the Force itself, all of that moved into one camp while the other camp trained itself to look away. In that sense, the buried weapon stopped being a machine and became a symbol. It marked the moment the Jedi pivoted from explorers to gatekeepers, from an order that mapped the Force to an order that patrolled the boundaries of what it was willing to know. And when the enemy is adaptive, patient, and absolutely hungry for information, facing them with self-imposed ignorance is its own kind of superweapon aimed straight back at the Republic's defenders. That self-imposed ignorance didn't stay buried in that one era. It echoed across centuries, across mediums. Every time the franchise walks into a forbidden temple or a dead patch in the Force, it's brushing against the same wound the Jedi tried to seal when they entombed that engine. Star Wars Rebels makes this visual. The planet was Lothal. The year was the dying days of the Empire. On the surface, it's a quiet backwater. Underneath, it's a pressure point in the Force. Ancient structures, massive kyber veins, and an imperial occupation that looks less like a standard garrison and more like a science project. That was about to change very quickly once the Empire realized those crystals could do more than power a single superlaser. Lothal's kyber-based weaponry, the experimental TIE Defender reactors, even the abandoned plan to weaponize the Jedi Temple itself, all play with the same idea: build a structure that doesn't just channel energy, but amplifies states of mind. Fear, rage, despair, the Sith engine this video has been following, did that by design. On Lothal, the Empire stumbles into a similar effect as a side consequence of its obsession with control. Then there's the Sith Temple on Malachor, a battlefield frozen in ash, littered with petrified corpses, centered on a machine that turned a war into a massacre in a single moment. The landscape is drained, colorless, wrong. Canon Ezra and Ahsoka fill the place before they see it. The Force there isn't just dark, it's disrupted, as if someone tried to run it through a reactor and crack the casing. It wasn't a perfect system. The world between worlds takes that even further. A literal construct that lets a single person tug on time, life and death by walking a corridor. Mechanized mysticism. It is not the buried engine, but it rhymes with it. A built environment that lets intent echo across distance and history, forcing the Jedi to confront the question they try to bury. What happens when you turn the Force into infrastructure? The Mandalorian shifts the focus from stone to flesh. No ancient temple, no obvious Sith, but the same obsession. The remnants of the Empire want Grogu's blood, not to make one powerful warrior, but to seed an entire program. Cloning vats on Navarro, Dark Trooper projects, experiments on Navarro's prisoners, all hint at biological or hybrid systems meant to shape the Force across distances. An army that broadcasts submission. A leader whose will rides on every altered cell. Across all of this, the imagery repeats. Worlds stripped for kyber. Forests flattened into grey plains. Characters talking about places that feel cold in the Force or empty, even when they're full of life. This is the story of a galaxy quietly reacting to scars it doesn't remember getting. Whether or not this specific Legends era engine ever gets named on screen, the franchise keeps circling the same problem. Industrialize the Force, and you industrialize trauma. Turn mysticism into machinery, and someone will try to run a war through it. So when later stories show temples, drained worlds, or experiments on Force sensitives, they stop being isolated curiosities and become part of a long conversation about power, control, and the cost of treating the Force as raw material. The buried weapon is a lens. It turns Rebels, The Mandalorian, and everything beyond into echoes of one ancient decision, to hide a horror instead of heal the wound it left. And the Sith was still listening for those echoes. So what happens if someone actually finds the source? Not a Palpatine with a Senate and a clone army, but something smaller. Weirder, the first crack in the tomb doesn't start with a fleet. It starts with a whisper. Picture a fringe sect of dark side mystics, the kind the Council dismisses as failed acolytes and failed academics. They track rumors of the quiet engine to a dead moon, trip the ancient safeguards, and manage a partial activation. Not full power, just a low, sullen hum. Local systems don't explode, they go numb. Force sensitives wake up and feel their connections slide sideways as if the galaxy has been wrapped in cloth. Jedi on patrol find meditation turning to static. Sith agents, reaching for rage, feel their anger flatten into irritation. Duels end early because neither fighter can bring themselves to care enough to finish it. This is the story of a weapon that doesn't burn planets, it sands down the edges of every emotion within reach. At first, nobody understands. The Council blames exhaustion, the Sith blame Jedi interference, and both sides quietly wonder if the war has finally broken them. Reports come in from one sector, riots just stop. Separatists and Republic garrisons stare at each other across barricades and drift back to their barracks. It wasn't a perfect system. Pilots still fly, smugglers still smuggle. But the spark behind every decision feels half a step removed. That was about to change very quickly. Because every partial activation is a test. Once someone proves the engine can wake up, someone more ambitious will try to run it at full power. On a full-scale firing, the field doesn't stay local. It rolls out through hyperspace lanes and trade routes, following the same arteries that carried war. Entire sectors slip into synchronized apathy. Revolutions fizzle on their first march. Authoritarian regimes, from petty warlords to planetary governors, suddenly find resistance evaporating. The Senate can pass whatever it wants. No one on the ground has the energy to enforce or oppose it. For the Force-sensitive, reality gets stranger. Some dark side practitioners discover that in the engine's shadow, cold calculation works better than fury. Their lightning is weaker, but their influence is sharper, more precise. Others, especially traditional Sith, who rely on raw passion, find their power inverted. Rage curdles into detachment. Their signature moves misfire, so alliances bend. A Jedi Master who can no longer feel compassion clearly might need a former Sith assassin whose emotions were always dialed down to begin with. Fringe cults that studied neutral force techniques suddenly become strategic assets. Old enemies have to cooperate just to remember why anything mattered in the first place. The real stakes aren't just battles. They are the hero's own capacity to care. Every act of compassion becomes a climb through molasses. Every sacrifice requires pushing against a cosmic sedative. Imagine trying to rally a rebellion when the Force itself keeps whispering that it's not worth the effort. If the engine runs long enough, the galaxy doesn't fall into flames. It settles. No grand wars, but no meaningful freedom either. A low-conflict, high-oppression equilibrium where tyrants rule not through fear, but through universal shrug. The planet was everywhere. The year was every year after. And somewhere in that manufactured calm, something else would start to move. That something is the part the Sith never quite understood. If the Force is not just energy but a living field, then a weapon that leans on it too hard might not just reshape the galaxy. It might provoke a reaction. Think of it as an immune system. The engine pushes everything toward apathy, toward fear made ordinary, toward a republic that forgets how to resist. That was about to change very quickly. Because a field that binds all life together doesn't have to swing a lightsaber to fight back. It can nudge. It can concentrate probability. It can start dropping Vergences in places no council chart ever predicted. This is the story of the Force doing something the Jedi never formally admitted, compensating. As the engine tries to bias the current, new eddies appear. Children on backwater worlds, born with impossible sensitivity. Smugglers who suddenly see a half second into the future and swerve away from a cult transport. Pilgrims who wake from shared nightmares, all seeing the same black monolith buried under a nameless temple and turn around before they ever reach it. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino was a clone army waiting for a war. What the Force might start seeding in response to a galaxy tilted toward despair is an army of anomalies. Not trained, not organized, just inconveniently resistant. A senator who feels sick every time she enters a certain sector and quietly kills a funding bill. A storm that appears from clear skies and obliterates the dig site of a Sith archaeological cell. A hyperspace lane that keeps misaligning when cult freighters try to converge on the buried engine. There is precedent. Anakin as the Chosen One, conceived by the midichlorians themselves, is already framed in canon as the Force pushing back against a millennium of Sith shadow. Rey's sudden power, emerging from the wreckage of empire and war, reads as the field refusing to let one bloodline, one doctrine, own it forever. Even the rise of Force-sensitive groups outside the Jedi and Sith Guardians of the Whills, Lasat Mystics, Night Sisters looks different through this lens. The Force diversifying its portfolio after watching 1,000 generations of Republic history get funneled through a single binary that keeps failing. But it wasn't a perfect system. The engine does not erase the Force, it leans on it. The response would be slow, fragmented, channeled through frightened beings with limited information and their own agendas. For every miracle storm that wrecks a cult convoy, there might be a vision misunderstood, a warning dream dismissed as stress, a potential chosen one who dies in some anonymous skirmish on the rim. Still, even in a galaxy where fear is easier than hope by design, the field keeps trying. One child who refuses to betray a friend. One deserter clone who feels a wrongness in his chip and runs. One Jedi who hears the quiet and decides silence is not balance. The planet was everywhere. The year was every year after. And somewhere down that line, the engine's creators would discover that the Force had been quietly preparing its own counterattack all along. This is the story of a weapon that never points a barrel at anyone and still manages to aim an entire world. The Dark Engine doesn't grab minds one by one. It reaches behind them into the weather system of the Force and changes the climate. On that deadened world, people weren't walking around as drooling slaves. They went to markets. They argued with their families. The Senate still met. The Council still gave missions. But the baseline had shifted. Hope felt heavy. Outrage felt inconvenient. Courage felt inefficient. The engine made despair the path of least resistance, the way a gravity well makes falling easier than climbing. That was about to change very quickly for anyone who stepped into its field. Because this is not just a Sith horror story, it is a mirror. The Dark Engine doesn't scream commands, it whispers probabilities. That is what propaganda does when it runs for decades instead of days. That is what an algorithm does when it decides which fears get amplified to millions of people and which acts of compassion vanish in the scroll. No single Sith stands there twirling a mustache. No Massassi army marches through the streets. The influence is invisible, and that is exactly why it is so dangerous. The Jedi on that planet felt the wrongness. A clone trooper might pause before firing. A senator might hesitate before signing another emergency decree. But there is no obvious villain to point at, no malevolence to destroy, no battle station plans to steal from Geonosian archives. So resistance becomes harder. Resignation becomes easier. This is just how the galaxy turns into an unspoken creed. It wasn't a perfect system. The Force kept slipping through the cracks. But the point of the engine was never perfection. It was pressure. Constant, low-grade, deniable pressure. And someone chose that. A Sith engineer looked at their understanding of the Force and made a decision. Not to heal, not to stabilize, but to weaponize emotional probability at scale. The same way a holonet magnate can decide whether their platform rewards empathy or rewards panic and outrage because panic sells more ad space. The same way a war profiteer in the Republic can push for security measures that just happen to keep fear at a profitable simmer. The Jedi response was also a choice. Faced with a weapon that targeted the background of consciousness itself, the Council buried it, sealed records, restricted archives, temples built as prison walls around a machine they refused to fully study. They were terrified that even knowing its logic might replicate it. But hiding a catastrophe is its own kind of risk. When a society erases its worst experiments, it also erases the antibodies. Future generations grow up with no language for what is happening to them. So what Obi-Wan found, centuries later in another war, was a galaxy primed for soft superweapons, inhibitor chips no one remembered to fear, emergency powers no one remembered to question, a Senate that sleepwalked into an empire. Understanding the Dark Engine's design does something the Burial never could. It teaches pattern recognition. It lets someone on a distant world look at a system that constantly nudges them toward apathy and say, that feels familiar. Because the most dangerous superweapons in any age are the ones that make fear feel normal. And the next part of this story is how the Jedi finally realized that burying a mirror doesn't stop it from reflecting the galaxy back at itself. So to see why burying the mirror didn't fix anything, the timeline has to be rebuilt. Because this is the story of a weapon that starts as a theory in one Sith mind and ends as a silent wound in the Force. At the very beginning, there isn't a machine, there's a question. An ancient Sith Lord, already steeped in rituals that cracked planets and bled Kyber, asks, what if the dark side didn't just corrupt people? What if it could tilt the entire field? That thought becomes a project. Centuries of research into Vergence chaining, into how multiple Force nexuses can be linked and driven by synchronized emotional fields. Temples are repurposed into laboratories. Massacres become data points. It wasn't a perfect system. But slowly, the equations start to work. Then, theory turns into testing. First, small engines on remote moons, each one anchored to minor Vergences and fed by captive cults whose fear and rage are carefully modulated. The results are subtle, local wildlife grows skittish, meditation becomes harder, the Force feels off to any Jedi passing through. That was about to change very quickly. The first full-scale firing chains multiple nexuses on a mid-rim world. The planet was X, the year was Y. When the engine cycles down, no cities are destroyed, no armies lie in ruins. Instead, the world is emotionally hollow. The entire biosphere registers as numb through the Force, and the echo travels far enough that the Jedi Council feels it on Coruscant. So now, a secret war begins. Jedi investigators follow that psychic aftershock across the galaxy, tripping over erased archives, dead cults, and a trail of broken holocrons that only raise more questions. Strike teams vanish. Others return with minds scarred, reporting a pressure in the Force that tries to rewrite what anger and fear even mean. In a battle above the weapon's first truly bleeding world, they finally see the engine itself, a lattice of dark side conduits wrapped around a chained Vergence, drinking in planetary emotion and rebroadcasting it. Destruction is an option. It is also a potential extinction event. The Council decides it's too risky. Containment becomes the only strategy. Jedi architects and seers design a mobile temple shell, a moving labyrinth of neutral stone and counterchants, built not to purify the engine, but to smother its reach. A siege operation follows, fleets pin down Sith defenders, guardians dive through fire to anchor the shell around the core, and then the entire construct is dragged, at sublight, on a long slow tow to a remote burial site. There, on a dead world with no natural Vergence, the engine is entombed, its presence ritually blurred, its location folded into misdirection and myth. The aftermath is almost quieter than the war. Records are sealed, then erased. Certain forms of research into large-scale dark side amplification quietly disappear from the archives. Doctrine shifts, the Council hardens its stance on forbidden knowledge and planetary Vergences, and a few masters carry unspoken orders to monitor any echo that feels remotely similar. Across the centuries, there are near misses. A Sith cult that deciphers half a star map. A rogue Jedi who stumbles onto a corrupted holocron. Each time, a small, deniable operation moves in and cuts the thread. By the time the Republic is fielding a clone army and the Senate is debating battle station budgets, almost no one remembers the original engine. But its shadow lingers. It changes how both Jedi and Sith think about power on a galactic scale. It proves that the Force itself can be weaponized as an atmosphere, not just a lightning bolt. And the next part of this story is what happens when someone finally comes close to turning that buried atmosphere back on. So when someone finally comes close to turning that buried atmosphere back on, the obvious comparison is the Death Star, a battle station the size of a small moon, a weapon that can blow up Alderaan on a view screen in the Senate and make every system in the Republic flinch. But here's the difference. The Death Star destroys planets physically. It vaporizes cities, oceans, mountains. It does not vaporize the Force. Survivors on other worlds still feel the ripples. They still grieve, rage, and rebel. Leia can still reach out. Obi-Wan can still stagger as millions of voices cry out and are suddenly silenced. The horror is enormous, but the basic wiring of the galaxy remains. This engine goes after the wiring. It doesn't just kill bodies, it attacks the very capacity to care that makes rebellion possible in the first place. Imagine Alderaan destroyed and the rest of the galaxy watching, and just shrugging. Not because they agree with the Empire, but because the emotional bridge between beings and the Force has been quietly thinned day after day until outrage feels optional. Starkiller Base and other energy drain weapons sit in the same category. They kill stars, they erase systems, they are spectacularly dramatic. A single shot carves a scar across the sky, and every holofeed in the Senate runs it on loop. That visibility creates terror, but it also creates resistance. It gives the Council, the Senate, and every underground cell something concrete to point at and say, that is the enemy. The buried engine doesn't give you that. There is no beam, no countdown, no superlaser tracking shot, just a statistical drift. Fewer Jedi sensing danger in the outer rim. More clones following orders without the faint nagging pull of conscience. Separatists hardening into ideology because it feels easier than empathy. This is the story of a weapon that wins by making opposition feel exhausting. Psychologically, that is far more efficient for long-term tyranny. A galaxy terrorized by visible threats still connects. People whisper. Smuggle, pray, a galaxy where people feel less inclined to connect at all is quiet by default. Armies still march, wars still happen, but the shared moral temperature drops a few degrees and almost no one notices until entire eras feel colder. And then there is the problem of time. Rebuilding a destroyed city is possible. Rebuilding a shattered planet is theoretically possible. It wasn't a perfect system, but the Republic had reconstruction programs, relief fleets, Senate committees. Given enough credits and enough years, Durasteel goes back up. Crops regrow. Trade routes reopen. Restoring a galaxy-wide tilt in the Force is another scale entirely. If the engine runs long enough, the baseline of what it feels like to be alive in the Force changes. That damage doesn't end with a treaty. It echoes through lineages, through training, through how the next generation of Jedi even understands what balance means. Millennia might not be enough to undo it, if undoing it is possible at all. So in terms of existential threat to what Star Wars is actually about, the relationship between beings and the Force itself, this buried construct stands above the more famous planet killers. The Death Star threatens where you live. Starkiller threatens the star that warms you. This engine threatens the reason you would ever stand up and fight. And the terrifying part is simple. If someone in the age of clones, separatists, and secret Sith emperors finds a way to restart it, no one will see the war it begins until the war is already over. So the Jedi do the impossible. They don't just turn the engine off. They don't just walk away and hope the Sith never find it again. They coordinate an operation that makes Geonosis look small. Multiple systems evacuated. Whole sectors quarantined under fake plague notices. Strike teams of knights and masters moving in perfect silence to cage a machine that wants to erase the reason they exist. This is the story of the Jedi at their absolute peak. Not as warriors in a war, but as guardians of the entire galaxy's sanity. They design a prison made of stone, song, and force geometry, layering light-side counterfields over a buried dark-side core. They calculate that actually destroying the engine could send a shockwave through hyperspace, so they choose a slower victory. Containment, encasing it in a dead vault, then dropping that vault into a planetary wound in the Force. It's their greatest coordinated act since the founding of the Republic. It isn't a perfect system, because the cost is brutal. Hundreds of Jedi never fully reconnect to the Force after standing that close to a weapon that severs it. Some lose their connection entirely and quietly retire to agricultural core and distant outposts. Whole worlds are emptied, then resettled under different names, so no one asks why a single unremarkable planet has a no-fly zone enforced for 1,000 years. The Order wins, and chains itself to a tomb that has to be guarded, masked, and lied about forever. And that's where the real damage begins. Not in the vault, in the Council. The experience convinces the senior masters that most Jedi cannot be trusted with the full truth. That if knowledge of this engine spreads, someone, somewhere, will try to use it. So they carve new layers into the archives, restricted holocrons, redacted mission logs, memory wipes for a few unfortunate witnesses. A tiny circle holds the secret. Everyone else is told a legend about a nameless dark Vergence and nothing more. Over centuries, that reflex calcifies. By the time of the Clone Wars, the pattern is familiar. Prophecies about the Chosen One are locked away. Visions about the future of the Republic are discussed in closed council chambers. Anakin is trusted to lead legions of clones into battle, but not trusted with the full picture of what the Council fears. The Jedi have an army, the Sith have a plan, and the Order has a habit of keeping its knights in the dark. Pattern interrupt. The Sith aren't the only ones playing a long game. Palpatine benefits from a mindset he didn't create. A hierarchy that already believes shielding dangerous truths is the responsible choice. So when a quiet chancellor asks for secrecy, for special assignments, for Jedi to spy on the Senate, it feels familiar. The same logic that buried a Sith weapon now helps bury red flags. The verdict is bitter. The Jedi saved the galaxy from one apocalypse by hiding that engine where no one would ever find it. But in doing so, they nudged themselves onto a path of secrecy and isolation that made them far easier to blind when a different, quieter apocalypse came wrapped in robes, smiling from the Chancellor's office. That hidden war in the shadows does something strange. It makes the Jedi look both more impressive and more fragile. Because suddenly, the Council's arrogance in the prequel era doesn't come out of nowhere. This is the story of an Order that once hunted down a force-breaking engine built by the Sith, fought it across dead worlds, and actually won. They contained something that weaponized the dark side on a scale the Death Star would only imitate in metal. After that, trusting their ability to sense any real threat felt earned. Until it wasn't. So when Mace Windu walks through the Senate and says the Jedi will know if the dark side is clouding everything, that overconfidence has a history behind it. The planet was X, the year was Y. A Jedi strike team stared into a machine that could rewrite the Force and lived. The Republic survived. The archives recorded a victory. The fear and the cost got buried with the engine. That was about to change very quickly. The secrecy around the weapon also reframes all the quiet censorship that surrounds the Order, the restricted archives, the missions that never show up in clone briefings, the way even masters flinch at certain Sith names. Decisions that can look purely controlling or hypocritical start reading as overcorrections to a genuine near-extinction event. The Council once saw what happens when curiosity and compassion meet industrialized darkness, and their response was to build walls. Around knowledge, around emotions, around themselves. It wasn't a perfect system. That same instinct to lock everything away is what pushes Anakin out, makes Ahsoka question the Council, and turns the Jedi Temple into an echo chamber right when the Senate and the Chancellor need to be questioned the most. The tragedy is that the secrecy makes sense, it just comes due at the worst possible time. And then there is Palpatine. Knowing the Jedi once beat a weapon that could tear at the Force itself makes his victory over them look even colder. Earlier Sith tried to conquer the galaxy with engines and armies, with superweapons that screamed their existence across every star. Palpatine studies that history and does the opposite. No planet killer, no Force overwriting machine. Just a war, a clone army, a senate, and 1,000 tiny legal changes that turn the Republic into an empire while the Council is staring at the wrong kind of threat. Against that backdrop, the Force itself feels different. This isn't the first time someone tried to mechanize it, quantify it, chain it to a reactor. The fact that the galaxy is still standing implies something fought back. The living Force throws up Vergences, chosen individuals, improbable survivals. Anakin on Tatooine, Rey on Jakku, Luke on a moisture farm. Each one looks less random and more like the same cosmic defense mechanism that survived the buried engine's first activation. So this secret chapter doesn't contradict the saga at all. It deepens it. The Jedi's flaws become earned scars. The Sith's evolution from brute force to systemic manipulation becomes clearer. And every new attempt to control the Force sits in the shadow of a machine the galaxy will never officially remember, but the Force clearly has not forgotten. And that brings the story back to the quiet, terrifying victory the Sith actually won. The most successful lie the Sith ever told was simple. The dark side is about people. Names, masks, Darth this, Darth that. A jewel in a throne room. A superlaser on a battle station, something you can point a clone army at and blow up. In that version of history, evil is always a person with a red blade and a bad cape. That was about to change very quickly the moment the engine came online. Because the buried weapon doesn't care about individuals, it operates at the level of fields, atmospheres, emotional climates. It turns the Force over an entire region into a hostile environment for compassion and trust, and then lets ordinary politics do the rest. This is the story of the Sith thinking in terms of rewriting the rules, not just winning the current war. Ancient Sith lords who built engines like this weren't trying to be better duelists. They were trying to edit the operating system of the galaxy, make fear the default setting, make empathy physically harder. Once that ambition exists, it never really goes away. The specific machine can be buried, the schematics can be lost. But the idea that the dark side can be weaponized as infrastructure, as a background condition, survives in every later Sith plan. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino was a secretly commissioned army. What the Jedi never wanted anyone to find in their own archives was proof that this had all happened before, on a different scale. A constructed crisis, a manipulated climate, a war that seemed inevitable because the Force itself had been tilted. It wasn't a perfect system. The engine's effects were unstable, dangerous even to its creators. That is why the Council chose burial over use. Ironically, that secrecy is how the lie spreads. The Jedi seal the records. The Council classifies entire campaigns. The Senate never hears the full report. Centuries later, the Empire's propaganda talks about traitor Jedi and heroic order. The New Republic obsesses over shipyards, fleets, and visible separatists. Most beings learn to think in terms of planets and blasters, not the temperature of the Force in a room when a demagogue speaks. Palpatine is the masterpiece of this lie. Publicly, he plays the role, just another Sith Lord with big guns and bigger superweapons. Privately, his real war is against trust itself, against democracy's ability to self-correct, against the Jedi's ability to sense him in the Force. He turns the Senate into a ritual of fear. He turns the Clone Wars into a broadcast engine, radiating paranoia into every home. And once the buried weapon is known, his methods stop looking original. They look familiar, a galactic echo of an older machine that poisoned faith in the Force on purpose. Because if a Sith engine can bend emotions across a sector, what happens when a Sith Chancellor learns to do it with a smile, a holonet camera, and an entire war? The answer is buried in the same place the engine is, and someone is already digging. The answer is buried, the engine is sealed, the records are gone. But the question the Jedi Council faced when they stood over that humming core never really went away, because their choice was brutally simple. Destroy the engine and risk tearing open the Force itself, not just an explosion, but a psychic detonation that could ripple through hyperspace lanes, temple worlds, whole sectors of the galaxy, or contain it, bury it under stone and secrecy, trust that no one would ever find it, and accept that one day someone probably would. So imagine that council chamber. 12 masters, one weapon that can poison belief across a sector, and 2 doors. Through the first, obliterate the machine, maybe trigger a dark side shockwave that severs billions from the Force in an instant. Through the second, build a prison around it, erase it from the archives, and gamble that future generations never grow complacent, corrupt, or desperate enough to dig. Now add politics. Do you walk into the Senate and tell every representative, every lobbyist, every future warlord that a Sith device exists which can break entire populations without firing a single blaster shot? Do you put that on the holonet and hope panic doesn't do more damage than the engine ever could? The Republic panicked over trade routes. This is the story of a weapon that can rewrite faith. Pattern interrupt. What if the Council had done the opposite of what it usually does with forbidden knowledge? No restricted archives, no sealed doors. Every knight, every Padawan briefed on exactly what this engine is, where it was found, how it works. Total transparency inside the Order. That was about to change very quickly the moment one ambitious Jedi decided the ends justified the means. So what Obi-Wan found on Geonosis was a droid foundry in a war. What these ancient Jedi found was something worse, a reason to doubt that any institution, even the Jedi, could be trusted with certain truths. Would you have trusted 10,000 Jedi with the full schematics of a belief-breaking machine, knowing that in 1,000 years one of them might fall to the Sith? Real-world parallel time. Nuclear weapons, AI systems that can destabilize economies or elections, bioengineering that can edit whole species. Destroying them risks losing the knowledge to defend against them. Keeping them risks proliferation. Hiding them concentrates power in a tiny circle that might not stay virtuous forever. It wasn't a perfect system. So, if the vote were yours, what happens to the engine? Total destruction and a roll of the cosmic dice? Permanent burial and institutional amnesia? Full disclosure to the Senate? Or a secret only a handful of masters are allowed to carry? Drop a comment with the choice that makes the most sense and the one that scares you more. Because the next part of this story is one council's answer. Not the only answer, just the one that shaped the Clone Wars, the Empire, and a future Sith who learned to do with politics what that engine did with pure dark side power. The galaxy moves on. Wars ignite and burn out, but out past the trade lanes and the hyperroutes, in a system that never made it onto Senate start charts, something the Jedi refused to name is still exactly where they left it. The planet was forgotten. The year was irrelevant. Down here, time is just pressure and stone. The camera drifts past a dead star through a thin halo of frozen dust, then drops toward a lightless world where no beacon flashes and no transponder pings back. No Republic survey. No separatists relay. Just a silent rock turning in an uncaring dark. This is the story of what the Jedi chose not to destroy. The view punches through crust and mantle in a slow, impossible descent, layer after layer of compressed history. Petrified seas. Magma veins. Old fault lines locked in place since before the Republic had a Senate to argue in. The deeper it goes, the quieter it gets, until even tectonic groans fade out and there is only one sound left. The tomb sits where the Jedi built it, a geometrically perfect chamber carved into bedrock and then hidden beneath another kilometer of stone. No doors, no shafts, no access corridors, just a hollow in the planet's bones, lined with metal that was never on any Republic procurement list and inscribed with sigils no ordinary knight was trained to read. Dust lies thick on the floor, piled in undisturbed drifts that have not known a footprint in centuries. The ancient Jedi inscriptions along the walls have started to fade, their edges softened by time and microfractures, oaths and warnings eroding one hairline crack at a time. It wasn't a perfect system. Nothing involving the dark side ever is. But for generation after generation, it has held. At the center of the chamber, the encased engine waits, a black, multifaceted core suspended in a lattice of pale containment fields, wrapped in concentric rings of frick and stone. The device is dormant. No lightning, no visible motion, yet from its heart, a slow, sullen pulse ripples outward, each beat a tiny pressure wave in the force, like the heartbeat of something that should have died but did not. The only sounds here are the soft, insectile buzz of the containment lattice and that distant, muffled thrum. Every few minutes, one field flickers, dimming by a fraction before flaring back to full intensity. A tiny failure, a tiny correction. If anyone were here, they might miss it. The Council once relied on hidden monitors and relay beacons to track those fluctuations. Those relays burned out 100 years and 2 galactic borders ago. Above, empires have risen and fallen. The Clone War exploded, clones marched, Jedi died, the Republic became the Empire, and then something else again. Death Stars were designed, built, and shattered into expanding rings of debris. That was about to change very quickly, over and over, and then it did. But none of those battles ever reached this room. Because the truth is, the galaxy's loudest weapons are not always its most dangerous. The Senate debated budgets and fleets. Sith plotted over star maps and succession. Out here, beyond the maps and the myths, an older equation remained unsolved. A microquake ripples through the bedrock, just enough to send a faint trickle of dust down from the ceiling. The engine's pulse stutters once, then resumes, a hair stronger than before. In the Force, there is a whisper. No Jedi on any council is close enough to hear it. Somewhere out there, beyond the maps and the myths, the Jedi's darkest secret is still waiting in the dark. The engine keeps beating in the dark, and that pulse is the whole problem. The deeper someone understands a fundamental force, the more they can bend it. The Force, technology, politics, none of them stay small once someone learns how to scale them. This is the story of what happens when that understanding outruns any sense of responsibility. The Sith engineer proved that in the most horrifying way possible. This wasn't a warlord waving a red blade on a battlefield. This was a mind that treated the galaxy as a laboratory. Equations instead of ethics, test runs instead of mercy. Their brilliance didn't just create a weapon that killed, it created a machine that rewrote the conditions of life and choice themselves, turning entire regions into controlled experiments in fear, obedience, and silence. Ancient Sith superweapons had always terrified the Jedi. Planet killers could be fought with fleets, armies could be met with armies. But a device that reached into the Force, drained life, and rewired how beings felt the world? That was about to change very quickly how the Order thought about knowledge itself. The Council stopped asking, "How do we win?" and started asking, "What happens if anyone, ever, learns this again?" So the Jedi did something they almost never did on this scale. They used institutional power as a shield. Strike teams with no names, missions filed under sealed codes, temples turned into prisons around a single engine. In those moments, the Jedi were at their best, courageous, coordinated, willing to die to keep the galaxy from becoming a permanent experiment in Sith control. But the same act contained a quieter failure. To bury the Dark Engine, the Council also buried the story. Archives were edited, Padawans were steered away from certain questions. Masters who had stood in that chamber watched the Senate debate trade routes and never mentioned the day reality nearly broke. It wasn't a perfect system. Fear had crept in, and fear always wants to erase, not explain. So what Obi-Wan found in the Clone Wars were inhibitor chips, secret armies, and a republic that had forgotten how many times it had already been manipulated. The pattern rhymed. Knowledge, hoarded at the top. Power, concentrated in a few hands. Everyone else, living inside decisions made generations ago, with no idea what had been locked beneath their feet. On an individual level, the scale is smaller, but the dynamic is the same. Every person who understands a system, a bureaucracy, a network, a code base, holds a miniature dark engine in their hands. Influence can narrow someone's choices with a sentence or expand them with a warning. Information can be used to win arguments or to help someone see options they did not know existed. That is the real cautionary tale buried with the weapon. Not just the danger of Sith ambition, but the risk that even heroes stop asking whether their solutions are truly protective, or just postponing harder conversations about trust, transparency, and shared responsibility. The planet was forgotten. The year was erased. But the question of who gets to decide what the galaxy is allowed to know has never gone away. And the next time a pulse like that starts in the dark, it may not be the Jedi who find it first. That buried question doesn't stay on that forgotten world. It echoes forward. It reaches all the way to a throne room on the second Death Star, where a son stands over his father with a lightsaber raised. Luke has every reason to strike. The war, the terror, the friends lost. The Emperor is begging him to turn anger into a weapon, to make the Force a lever for control. And Luke steps back, throws the saber away. In a galaxy that has been nudged, pressured, and quietly engineered to treat power as the only language that matters, Luke's real victory is refusing to speak it. This is the story of resistance that runs underneath the entire saga. Not just resistance to the Empire or the Separatists or the latest Sith Lord with a new superweapon. It is resistance to the Dark Engine's logic itself. Turn everything into a system, a circuit, a predictable reaction. Turn the Force from a relationship into a machine that always does what it is told. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino during the Clone Wars was one expression of that logic. A clone army ordered in secret, lives reduced to inventory, the Force-bound individuality of millions compressed into a production schedule. The planet was Kamino. The year was 22 BB. It wasn't a perfect system. It kept glitching. Clones remembered they were people. Jedi remembered, briefly, that they were guardians, not generals. Across the trilogies, the hero's greatest acts are not about better weapons or smarter battle plans. They are refusals. Ahsoka walking away from the Jedi Council rather than let her life be one more cog in a war she no longer trusts. Rey reaching out to Ben Solo in a burning throne room, seeing a person where the galaxy sees a monster and a potential asset. Again and again, the real turning points come when someone chooses connection over fear in a galaxy trained to pick fear every time. In the background, the buried engine's worldview keeps trying to reassert itself. Planet killers that promise security through terror. Cloning projects that promise loyalty through design. Inhibitor chips, battle droids, Starkiller bases, different hardware, same firmware. The Sith rise and fall, the Senate changes logos, but that fantasy of total control over outcomes and over each other's hearts never really leaves the conversation. By learning this erased chapter, the audience becomes part of the memory the Jedi tried to scatter. The war against that idea is not fought only with sabers and starfighters. It is fought with stories that remind the galaxy that the Force is not safe, not controllable, and not supposed to be. Star Wars has always been about more than lightsabers and starships. It's about what we do when someone offers us power over each other's hearts. And somewhere, under rock and ash and broken wards, something built to make that offer perfectly is still waiting to be found. But now the question shifts from the Jedi to the audience. The engine is buried, the wards are cracked, the galaxy has forgotten. What happens next is not in the archives, it lives in imagination and argument. Out of every Sith superweapon in Star Wars, which one actually keeps you up at night? The Death Star is obvious. One shot, one planet, one Senate speech about peace and security. Starkiller Base turns whole stars into ammunition. The Starforge just keeps building an endless army until the Republic collapses under the weight. But a device that rewrites the Force itself, that reaches past armor and shields and straight into memory and willpower, might be worse than all of them. Is this buried engine actually more terrifying than anything the Empire ever fielded, precisely because no one would even know they'd lost? This is the story of a galaxy that keeps pretending its worst nightmares are over. That was about to change very quickly the moment someone, somewhere, starts digging in the wrong ruin. So imagine this engine pulled into future canon. Who finds it first? A scavenger on a forgotten world, chasing legends of Sith gold and getting something far more dangerous? A remnant Imperial warlord, desperate to claw back relevance after the fall of the Empire? Or a disillusioned Jedi survivor convinced the only way to stop the next war is to control the thing that ends all choice? Picture the moral geometry of that. A Jedi standing in front of the control dice, hearing the echoes of 1,000 council warnings. A former clone deserter remembering inhibited chips and realizing this is that same horror, just scaled to the entire galaxy. A young Senate reformer told that with one activation, crime, rebellion, separatists, all of it could be calmed. Do they walk away or press the switch and tell themselves they'll turn it off later? And here's the harder question. Should the next generation of Jedi even go looking for this tomb? Should a rebuilt order send an expedition, document everything, bring the engine into the light so no Sith can ever surprise the Republic with it again? Or did the old council get it right the first time that some knowledge is a war by itself, and the most responsible act is to let the mountain keep its secret? Drop theories in the comments. Name the character, the era, the planet. The year was whatever you decide. It wasn't a perfect system, but the best Star Wars debates rarely are. If there's someone in your life who loves deep-cut lore, ancient Sith science, and what if the real threat is still underground scenarios, send this video to them. Share it to that group chat that still argues about whether the Starforge could beat the Death Star. Because this engine is only one chapter. For more, there are full breakdowns of Sith superweapons, Jedi Black Ops missions, and the entire Clone Wars timeline, showing how a manufactured war primed the galaxy to accept monsters exactly like this. And the next section is going to dig even deeper into what the Jedi were willing to do and hide to keep that from happening again. Because this engine is only one chapter. For more, there are full breakdowns of Sith superweapons, Jedi Black Ops missions, and the entire Clone Wars timeline, showing how a manufactured war primed the galaxy to accept monsters exactly like this. And the next section is going to dig even deeper into what the Jedi were willing to do and hide to keep that from happening again. So if you made it all the way through this buried history, through erased wars, forbidden engines, and the quiet terror in the Council's decisions, that already says something. The galaxy is huge. The archives are deeper. Most beings in the Republic never even knew these weapons existed. This is the story of what happens in the spaces between the movies. The secret missions the Senate never debated. The Jedi strike teams that left no records except a redacted line in a restricted archive. Every episode here is about pulling on those threads until the tapestry of the war, the Jedi and the Sith feels bigger, stranger, and more connected than it looked on the surface. Ancient Sith constructs that drink the Force dry. Clone units reassigned to training exercises that were actually artifact retrievals. Council votes held at midnight so the Senate would never hear the questions being asked. That was about to change very quickly once these stories started getting pulled back into the light. So if that's the kind of galaxy you want to live in for a while, this is the place. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and pin this video in a playlist so it is waiting the next time there is a need to revisit how this engine worked, or to show a lore-hungry friend why the Jedi were so terrified of certain words in the archives. It wasn't a perfect system, but it does keep these long, complicated timelines one tap away when the next question hits. For a next step, there is a direct path deeper into the shadows. One recommendation here is the full breakdown of the Jedi's restricted archives, the shelves that only Masters were allowed to see, and the missions that filled them with classified reports. Or go straight into another Sith superweapon, the kind of planet killer that makes the Death Star look almost straightforward by comparison. The planet was X, the year was Y. The Council thought the danger was contained. It wasn't. Those stories are waiting on the channel now, ready to turn this single buried engine into part of a much larger pattern of Sith ambition and Jedi fear. So stay curious, keep an eye on the outer rim of the timeline, and remember, in the deepest stacks of the archives, there is always another secret, waiting to be found before the Sith find it first.